Good morning and happy Valentine's Day. Welcome to the February 2019 open meeting of the Federal Communications Commission. Madam Secretary, if you're feeling the love, could you please introduce the agenda for the morning?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Happy Valentine's Day. Good morning to you and good morning, Commissioners.
Good morning.
For today's meeting, you will hear 5 items for your consideration. First, you will consider a report and order establishing a schedule to end Connect America Fund Phase 1 support in price cap areas where winning bidders in the CAF Phase 2 auction will begin receiving Phase 2 support, and in areas that were not eligible for the auction, while providing interim support in areas that did not receive winning bids. Second, you will consider a notice of proposed rulemaking that proposes revisions to the Commission's NCE and low-power FM comparative processing and licensing rules. Third, you will consider a report and order eliminating the requirement in Section 73.2080F2 of the Commission's rules that certain broadcast television and radio stations file the Broadcast Midterm Report, Form 397. Fourth, you will consider a report and order, further notice of proposed rulemaking, and order to adopt measures and seek comment on others to enhance program management, prevent waste, fraud, and abuse, and improve emergency call handling in the IPCTS program. Fifth, you will consider a notice of proposed rulemaking proposing to amend the Commission's Truth in Caller ID rules to implement the anti-spoofing provisions of the Ray-Bombs Act. This is your agenda for today. The first item on your agenda will be presented by the Wireline Competition Bureau, and Chris Monteith, Chief of the Bureau, will give the introduction.
Thank you, Madam Secretary. Ms. Monteith, the floor is yours.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman and Commissioners, and happy Valentine's Day.
Likewise.
I can't think of anywhere else I'd rather be than Today, the Wireline Competition Bureau presents for your consideration a report and order that, if adopted, will continue the Commission's efforts to close the digital divide. Specifically, the order will continue our efforts to make broadband available for all Americans by phasing down legacy support in certain price cap areas to make greater funding available for voice and broadband services. The item adopts a transition framework to phase down Connect America Fund, or CAF, Phase 1 frozen support in areas where support will be awarded pursuant to the CAF Phase 2 auction. I would like to thank the staff of the Telecommunications Access Policy Division for their hard work on this item. I would also like to acknowledge the valuable input that we received from our colleagues in the offices of Economics and Analytics and General Counsel. Seated with me at the table from the Wireline Competition Bureau are Sue McNeil, Associate Chief, and from the Telecommunications Access Policy Division, Ryan Palmer, Chief, Alex Menard, Deputy Chief, Talmadge Cox, Telecommunications Broadband Analyst, and Stephen Wang, Attorney Advisor. Stephen will now present the item.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman and Commissioners.
Morning.
The report and order before you marks an important next step in closing the digital divide by providing certainty and stability in areas where support was awarded to provide broadband service through the Connect America Fund Phase 2 auction. Through that auction, the Commission last August awarded $1.488 billion in support over 10 years to deploy broadband in 45 states to 713,176 locations. Legacy support in those areas will thus be phased out in favor of new, more efficient support targeting broadband deployment. The item before you lays out a blueprint for this transition, which will free up funding for broadband in the country's hardest to serve areas. First, for price cap carriers that declined model-based support, the item uses the Connect America cost model to allocate those carriers Phase 1 frozen support among the census blocks they serve within a state, based on the relative costs of serving each area. Second, the item establishes a schedule for ending support to price cap carriers in areas that were successfully bid on during the auction, while providing interim support for areas that did not receive any bids. For fixed competitive eligible telecommunications carriers, that is, legacy competitive ETCs that provide voice service to fixed locations, The item resumes the previously adopted 2-year phase down of their legacy support. Finally, the item affords price-capped carriers and fixed competitive ETCs an option to decline interim legacy supports on a state-by-state basis. The Bureau recommends adoption of this item and requests editorial privileges with respect to technical and conforming edits. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Wang, and congratulations on your first presentation of an item at an FCC open meeting. We'll now turn to comments from the bench, beginning with Commissioner O'Reilly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. With the Connect America Fund Phase 2 auction finally completed, this item takes a logical and appropriate step to end legacy frozen support in areas that were subject to winning auction bids. As a strong supporter of a market-oriented, multi-round reverse auction approach to stretch scarce universal service dollars, the rules we adopt today provide clarity in implementing the phase-down of support funding. While I support the item, we probably could have done more to bring our existing definition of unsubsidized competitor in line with current marketplace for purposes of maintaining legacy support. Continuing to voice legacy support in areas where competitors provide service using another technology seems backwards looking and troubling, given how many Americans still lack access to broadband. I certainly appreciate the Chairman's willingness to limit this definition so that it only applies within the context of the high-cost program. On a global scale, we must recognize that in the eyes of many consumers, fixed and mobile services of similar functionality can be substitutes for each other, and that the Commission should be working to ensure that our rules are technology neutral. Separately, while I firmly agree with the item's decision to decline adopting a new voice support funding mechanism, it doesn't strike me as particularly fair to maintain price-capped carriers' unfunded mandate with respect to their high-cost and extremely high-cost areas. It's incumbent upon all of us to ensure that price-capped carriers' obligations are not indefinite and that these unfunded areas become subject to auction as soon as possible. Speaking of future USF auctions, the completion of the CAF Phase 2 auction and ensuring transition of support is by no means the end of the road in the Commission's efforts to bring broadband to unserved Americans. Notwithstanding the significant number of locations with winning bids, approximately 9 million Americans remain without any 10.1 megabit service, at least according to our last report. With the culmination of CAF Phase 2 auction, I am eager to finally seek solutions via the long-awaited Remote Areas Fund auction and work with my colleagues to connect those most difficult to serve. And I thank the Chair and yield back.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Carr.
Thanks. Closing the digital divide, ensuring that every American has access to next-generation broadband and the opportunity it enables has been this FCC's top priority. And since early 2017, before my time on the Commission, FCC leadership has been reorienting our universal service programs to support this important goal. Today's order represents another step in that process. In it, we move away from legacy approaches to universal service so we can transition support to the winners of the FCC's $1.49 billion CAF 2 auction, providers that have committed to bringing broadband to more than 700,000 unserved locations within 10 years. In practical terms, today's vote will free up funding so more Americans in more parts of the country can benefit from new broadband networks. While on the Commission, I've had the chance to get outside of D.C. and meet with the construction crews that are doing the hard work needed to build this next-generation infrastructure. It's given me a firsthand look at our universal service programs in action. I've met with construction crews in places like Monroe, Nebraska, who are trenching fiber along a 20-mile stretch of State Highway 22. Their efforts will bring faster and more reliable broadband to over 900 rural households in an area with only 8 residents per square mile. I met Blake in Utqiagvik, Alaska, which is the northernmost community in the country. It's where the sun rose for the first time in months just a few weeks ago. It's surrounded by the Arctic Ocean on 3 sides and 200 miles of tundra to the south. But with the support from the FCC's Universal Service Program, Blake and his crew were busy stringing aerial fiber throughout the community. And back at ground level, Nate showed me the work he's done to pull fiber through the town's utilidors, which are climate-controlled tunnels located 13 feet beneath the Alaska permafrost. And just last week, I was in Sherman, Texas, a rural community about an hour's drive north of Dallas. That's where I met Andy and Luis, who run CNC directional boring. They're heading up a crew that's been turning dirt, putting in new conduit, and pulling fiber so the community can benefit from next generation broadband infrastructure. They said their crews and their services had been in high demand recently with families and businesses moving into the community, including a new medical park that's going up right near this deployment site. With the help of this broadband connection, the new facility will bring high-resolution imaging and other medical services to the community. So I'm glad the FCC is focused on making it easier for these crews and many others to bring more broadband to more Americans. I want to thank the staff of the Wireline Competition Bureau for your work on this decision. It has my support. Thanks.
Thank you, Commissioner. And I just want the General Counsel to confirm that the FCC assumes no liability for any work that Commissioner Carr did stringing fiber in Texas. Thank you, sir. Commissioner Rosenworcel.
We have broadband deserts in this country. We have places where networks do not reach and where digital opportunity is hard to find. Many of these locations are rural, but not all. The realities of redlining and harsh economics of service have put some populated places out of reach too. The unfortunate truth is that the Federal Communications Commission does not know with precision where these broadband deserts are, who is affected, and how well our policies work to bring connectivity to communities that have been left behind. Our broadband maps are woefully inadequate. They overstate coverage in too many areas and understate it in others. Fixing this problem is not for the faint of heart. But we will never manage problems that we do not measure. So I think this agency needs to repair our maps and improve the data we use to make decisions. Now, this is not the subject of our effort today, but boy, it hovers there in the background. Because here we transition universal service funds available for broadband support from existing providers to new winners in the Connect America Fund auction. And in practice, that means we were kicking off a process that will result in awarding nearly $1.5 billion for broadband support in over 700,000 new locations. The details are complex, but to the credit of the Wireline Competition Bureau, they are thoughtfully presented. So I support this decision today. However, going forward, we have a challenge. We cannot just hand out these billions and wait for broadband deserts to miraculously support digital life. We need to check. In other words, we need to audit where these dollars go, what commitments were made, and where deployment takes place. We need to map what was spent and where service resulted. There are too many communities across this country thirsty for better broadband. I am hopeful that with tools like the one we use here, we can address these broadband deserts. But we need to be mindful that we will only do so effectively if we have accurate data that informs our work. And on that score, we have work to do.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Starks.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. One day about 12 years ago, I was getting my hair cut at a barber shop in Kansas City. And like barbershops around the country, we were having a spirited discussion, and it had to have been about sports, much of it about the Kansas City Chiefs. And as tends to happen with debates on sports, everyone had strong opinions, but not everyone had the same set of facts. And so as I'm getting up from my seat, I suggested that we all go home and look up this information on the internet. and that the next time I come in for a haircut, we'd all figure out who was right. The shop got very quiet, and people started looking at me puzzlingly. And it soon became very real to me that I was the only person in this black barbershop that had a broadband connection at my home. And that experience crystallized a point that sticks with me to this very day, that access to affordable broadband is a necessity. Without it, the unemployed can't find and apply for jobs, students can't complete their homework, and patients can't connect to their doctors or get the health care that they need. Those without access are disadvantaged in countless ways that add up to living on the outskirts of today's digital society. Ensuring that everyone in America has access to affordable broadband is one of my top priorities. The Commission's Universal Service Program is one of the primary ways that we can help broadband get deployed everywhere. The recently completed CAF2 fund auction is an important step in getting broadband deployed where it is needed, and I congratulate the auction winners. They stepped up to provide broadband service in areas where others decided not to, and they agreed to build out over the upcoming 6 years until broadband reaches everywhere in the winning areas. I appreciate these commitments, and I'll be watching closely, both to celebrate their progress and ensure that the build-out commitments are met. Today's order takes critical steps towards starting to fund auction winners and ensuring that the Universal Service Program dollars are used efficiently. These steps bring us closer to achieving the goal of closing the digital divide. Much work does remain to be done, both in rural and urban areas. Rural and remote areas of America are some of the costliest to serve and have less service than urban areas. But make no mistake, there are many urban areas that lack the kind of quality and affordable broadband service needed to take part in our digital world. I am committed to finding solutions that will bring quality, affordable broadband everywhere in America. Many thanks to the staff of the Wireline Competition Bureau for your tireless efforts and commitments to getting people connected to broadband and for your work on this item.
Thank you, Commissioner. One of the most exciting Olympic track and field events is the 4x100 meter relay. And that is because the difference between gold and silver, or no medal at all, isn't as simple as which country has the fastest set of runners. To win, teams must also execute flawless handoffs of the baton from one runner to the next, which is an exercise requiring patience and coordination. One botched transfer of the baton and a team's race is effectively over. Since January of 2017, the FCC has been racing to close the digital divide and to expand broadband access in rural America. One important step toward accomplishing that goal was the Connect America Fund, or CAF2 auction, which will result in the award of about $1.49 billion to provide fixed broadband access in rural areas currently on the wrong side of the digital divide. Moreover, because support has been allocated through a competitive bidding mechanism, American taxpayers will be getting more bang for the buck. This is a concrete example of how the FCC is working to increase rural connectivity through market-based principles and public-private partnerships. Now, today's item is important because it is about the transfer of the baton from legacy CAF1 support to the CAF2 support that was won during the auction. In this order, we establish a seamless transition that will benefit rural Americans. We've also decided to maintain legacy CAF1 support in those areas that did not receive any funding from the CAF2 auction. In other words, if there is nobody yet there to take the baton, then the runner holding the baton needs to continue the race. In short, this order provides for a smooth handoff from yesterday's subsidies to a new, more efficient system that will help build tomorrow's broadband networks across rural America, while minimizing any potential loss of service and disruption to consumers. And it is a key step in the process of beginning to disperse CAF2 auction funds to winning bidders so that more Americans can participate in the digital economy regardless of who they are or where they live. We were able to get one leg closer to the finish line thanks to the hard work of the FCC's staff. Thanks to Talmadge Cox, Christian Hofley, Sue McNeil, Alexander Menard, Chris Monteith, Ryan Palmer, and Stephen Wang from the Wireline Competition Bureau, Ashley Boiselle, Valerie Hill, Tom Johnson, Billy Layton, Rick Mallon, and Linda Oliver from the Office of General Counsel, and Tavi Carrere and Eric Ralph from the Office of Economics and Analytics. Just like the winning runners in an Olympic relay race, their teamwork was critical to achieving this successful result. And with that, we will proceed to a vote on the item. Commissioner O'Reilly.
Yes.
Commissioner Carr.
Approve.
Commissioner Rosenworcel.
Approve.
Commissioner Starks.
Approve.
The chair votes aye as well. The item is adopted with editorial privileges granted as requested. Thanks for the great work, folks. Madam Secretary, could you please take us to item number 2 on today's agenda?
Mr. Chairman and Commissioners, the next item will be presented by the Media Bureau and is entitled Reexamination of the Comparative Standards and Procedures for Licensing Non-Commercial Educational Broadcast Stations and Low-Power FM Stations. Michelle Carey, Chief of the Bureau, will give the introduction.
Thank you, Madam Secretary. And Ms. Carey, whenever you're ready, the floor is yours.
Thank you.
And also, if you want some chocolate, let me know.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman and Commissioners.
Good morning.
Today, the Media Bureau presents a notice of proposed rulemaking aimed at streamlining our rules and procedures for awarding non-commercial educational FM and television broadcast stations and low-power FM stations, and otherwise improve our licensing procedures. Our goals are to expedite the initiation of new radio service to the public and eliminate unnecessary burdens on applicants. Joining me at the table are Albert Schulner, Lisa Scanlon, and Amy Vander Kerkhove from the Audio Division. Amy will present the item.
Mr. Chairman and Commissioners, we are pleased to present this notice of proposed rulemaking that would clarify and simplify our non-commercial educational, or NCE, broadcast station and low-power FM, or LPFM, selection and licensing procedures. The rule changes proposed in this MPRM will clarify processing procedure for future applicants and help initiate service to the public more quickly and efficiently. Due to the non-commercial nature of the NC and LPFM service, mutually exclusive, or MX, applications for new station licenses are not subject to auction, but rather are resolved by applying comparative procedures, which include a point system for selecting among MX applications. Applicants receive points for criteria established in our rules, with the license awarded to the applicant with the highest number of points, or with mandatory time sharing in the event of a tie. While the NCE and LPFM comparative procedures used in past filing windows facilitated the grant of several thousand new stations construction permits, processing challenges in many cases have resulted in the delay of new service to the public. This MPRM proposes to eliminate these processing challenges with certain rule changes. First, the MPRM proposes to eliminate the current requirement that NCE applicants amend their governing documents to pledge to maintain localism and diversity in order to receive points as an established local applicant and for diversity of ownership. Currently, there is a discrepancy between the rules and the instructions to the FCC form, which created undue confusion among applicants in prior filing windows. The MPRM seeks to simplify this and other rules and seeks comment on alternative measures to continue to safeguard our localism and diversity goals. The MPRM also seeks comments on ways to improve the NCE tiebreaker process and reduce the need for mandatory time sharing, an unpopular last resort option. The item also proposes to adopt a mandatory timeshare resolution process similar to the LPFM involuntary timeshare rules for MX NC applicants that are unable to arrive at a voluntary timeshare agreement. In addition, the MPRM proposes several changes designed to improve our licensing procedures. These proposals include clarifying aspects of the holding period rule that requires NCE permittees to maintain the features that led to their selection as the preferred applicant, reclassifying as a minor change gradual changes in governing boards of LPFM and NCE applicants, eliminating certain tolling notification requirements and tolling NCE and LPFM broadcast construction deadlines without notification from the permittee, extending the LPFM construction period from 18 months to a full 3 years to assist permittees struggling to complete construction, and finally allowing the assignment or transfer of LPFM permits after an 18-month holding period, and eliminating the 3-year holding period on assigning LPFM licenses. The Media Bureau recommends that the Commission adopt this notice of proposed rulemaking and requests editorial privileges to make necessary technical or conforming edits. Thank you.
Thank you for that presentation, Ms. Vanderkerkhove. We'll now proceed to comments from the bench, beginning with Commissioner Riley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm going to skip a statement, just make one point. I appreciate the action in the item, certainly in regards to LPFM, in that the Commission is affirming the Bureau position that is consistent with the law and our regs, and one that you didn't mention, in terms of in terms of pirate radio. That someone who's a purveyor of pirate radio is not eligible to obtain a license or be part of a board that would apply for an application. So I appreciate that is confirmed the Bureau's past decisions, and it will be clear to everyone that pirate radio is not acceptable. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Carr.
Thanks. This is one of those good government items that won't generate many headlines, but if adopted, it'll mean less paperwork and less litigation for broadcasters and more time spent on the air providing content to the American public. So thank you to the staff of the Media Bureau for your work to update our approach for resolving mutually exclusive applications for certain broadcast licenses. The notice has my support.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Rosenworcel.
All right, I have a little story. Opelousas is the largest city in St. Landry Parish in Louisiana. It's about 2 hours west of New Orleans, but if you go there, it feels a whole world away. It's deep in Acadiana. It's a place steeped in Creole tradition and justifiably proud of its place in music history. That's because Opelousas is where Zydeco began. A fusion of blues and two-step, heavy on the washboard and accordion, Zydeco was first fashioned in the fields just outside this city more than a century ago. But in the decades after its development, a curious thing happened. Zydeco disappeared from the radio in Opelousas. The airwaves featured pop, rock, country, and news, but not the distinctive sounds straight from the city's own backyard. That changed a few years ago when a nonprofit started a low-power FM station in Opelousas to bring Zydeco music back home. It's an amazing effort. I know because I visited KOCZ, and I was treated to a feast, alligator included, and I spent some time on air talking about the power of community radio. I believe it. I think that even in a day of expanding audio opportunity, there is still something special about a voice in the air. There's still something powerful about broadcasting that sounds like the community where it comes from. And today's rulemaking seeks to update our policies governing low-power FM radio and non-commercial educational broadcast stations. And in practice, this means we are proposing to update our system for selecting among competing applicants for these licenses and our principles governing localism and diversity for this subset of broadcasting interests. In addition, we seek comment on suggestions from low-power FM stakeholders that would make it easier for the transfer of licenses and underlying construction permits. I look forward to the record that develops. I look forward to the opportunity to update our rules. And I hope that this effort leads to many more local stations like KOCZ that give voice to the history, sounds, and stories that make communities across this country unique.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Starks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This notice of proposed rulemaking seeks comment on ways to improve the procedures we use to get and keep low-power FM radio stations and non-commercial educational radio and television, collectively NCE, stations on the air. I've long valued the service provided by NCE stations and have been intrigued by the hyper-local service and opportunities for new entrants that LPFM stations provide across the country. I'm generally in favor of designing processes that allow these licensees to spend the majority of their time on programming rather than paperwork. I will be interested in seeing how the record develops in this proceeding and will pay close attention to any comments discussing ways that proposed rule changes could impact localism or diversity. I'll vote to approve, and I'd like to thank the Media Bureau for their hard work on this item and their tireless effort working on with these applicants over the years.
Thank you, Commissioner. Over the last 20 years, the FCC has opened numerous filing windows and evaluated thousands of applications for non-commercial educational FM radio and low-power FM stations. Now, many of these applications were mutually exclusive, as we say. 2 or more were in conflict and could not simultaneously be granted. And that made them subject to our rules for evaluating which ones would prevail. Now, these rules have enabled the launch of thousands of new radio stations, providing a wide variety of content to American listeners. But some of them are needlessly complex, and they can trip up well-intentioned but inexperienced applicants seeking to bring new radio service to their communities. For instance, on at least one occasion, several applications had their application point totals reduced because they didn't properly amend their governing documents. With this notice, we tee up proposals to address this and other issues. For example, we propose to eliminate requirements involving languages that must be included in an organization's governing documents in order for that organization to be favorably recognized under our rules. Essentially, we're aiming to provide greater clarity to broadcast applicants and thus make the process easier for them, deliver more new services to the listening public, and reduce appeals of our comparative licensing decisions. As always, I, like my colleagues, would like to thank the hardworking staff that worked on this notice from the Media Bureau: Irene Bleiweiss, Jim Bradshaw, Michelle Carey, Tom Horan, Tom Hutton, Holly Sauer, Lisa Scanlon, Al Schuldener, Amy Van de Kerkhove, and Mike Wagner. And from the Office of General Counsel, Susan Aaron, Dave Consul, and Royce Sherlock. This item has my full support. With that, we'll proceed to a vote on the item. Commissioner O'Reilly.
Aye.
Commissioner Carr.
Approve.
Commissioner Rosenworcel.
Approve.
Commissioner Starks.
Approve.
Chair votes to approve as well. The item is adopted with editorial privileges granted as requested. Madam Secretary, could you please announce item number 3 on today's agenda?
Mr. Chairman and Commissioners, the third item, entitled Elimination of Obligation to File Broadcast Midterm Report, Form 397, under Section 73.2080F2, Modernization of Media Regulation Initiative, will be presented also by the Media Bureau, and Michelle Carey, Chief of the Bureau, will give the introduction.
Ms. Carey, we turn to you once again.
Thank you. The next item the Media Bureau presents is a reporting order eliminating the rule requiring certain broadcast television and radio stations to file Form 397, the EEO Broadcast Midterm Report. Joining me at the table are Martha Heller, Laura Elder, and Jonathan Mark of the Bureau's Policy Division. Jonathan will present the item.
Mr. Chairman and Commissioners, we are pleased to present this report and order that eliminates an outdated filing requirement without hindering the Commission's ability to conduct our statutorily required broadcaster equal employment opportunity practice midterm reviews. Section 334B of the Communications Act of 1934 requires the Commission to conduct a midterm review of certain broadcast stations' employment practices. Historically, Form 397 has been used to facilitate this review. However, nearly all of the information provided in Form 397 is already available to a broadcast station's online public inspection file. And following adoption of this order, we will modify the online public inspection file so that all this information will be easily accessible. In light of this, the report and order finds that Form 397 is no longer necessary, and in keeping with the Commission's goal of reducing unnecessary regulatory burdens, we eliminate the form. The Media Bureau recommends that the Commission adopt the report and order and requests editorial privileges to make any necessary technical or conforming edits. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Clark, for that compelling presentation. Now turn to comments from the bench. Commissioner O'Reilly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The form we send to the trash heap today, which requires our nation's broadcasters to file equal employment opportunity information for a midterm review, was one of the first that I targeted for elimination when the Commission started its media modernization proceeding. Currently, broadcasters provide an EEO contact person and their 2 most recent annual EEO reports, all of which is already available online. Information on whether a station meets the criteria to trigger a midterm review is not submitted elsewhere, however, so today's item sets up the requisite process as part of the online public inspection file. Therefore, all information needed for the Commission to conduct a midterm review of broadcasters' employment practices, which will continue, will be conveniently located in the online public file, making the Form 397 filing completely redundant. I did notice that we're including a future NPRM to examine and audit our EEO enforcement and ways to improve that. I'm hopeful, but do not necessarily expect that any ideas submitted will not violate the U.S. Constitution, Supreme Court precedent, or any existing law. We'll just have to see. I thank the chairman and staff for bringing this review to an expeditious conclusion, continuing to modernize our media rules, and putting an end to this unnecessary and burdensome reporting requirement. I will approve. I thank the chair.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Carr.
Thanks. Today, we take another step towards modernizing our media regulations. We do so by eliminating an unnecessary paperwork requirement that only pulls resources away from broadcasters' efforts to serve their communities. And we do so in a way that promotes compliance with our EEO rules, an effort that builds on our decision last year to move EEO matters to the Enforcement Bureau, where agents can draw on a broader pool of staff and resources to ensure EEO compliance. When the FCC first adopted Form 397, the Commission and the public had no other way to verify broadcasters' compliance with EEO obligations. But last March, the FCC completed the process of requiring broadcasters to include this data in their online public files. As a result, Form 397 is now duplicative, and thus commenters filed no opposition to our proposal to eliminate it. At the same time, we include an important technical fix in our decision, which allows the FCC to continue to identify those broadcasters that are subject to our EEO rules. With these decisions, the Commission can continue to carry out its important obligations under EEO laws without the unnecessary cost of this filing requirement. So I want to thank the staff of the Media Bureau for their continued work on media modernization initiatives. The item has my support.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Rosenworcel.
For decades, at the direction of Congress, the Federal Communications Commission has been responsible for policies that prohibit discrimination in hiring at broadcast stations. On the surface, today's decision is just about Form 397, known as the Broadcast Midterm Report. This report has been used for the review of station compliance with equal employment opportunity policies at the midpoint of a station's license cycle. However, the bulk of the information gathered on this form is already available in the public file. As a result, today the agency determines that with these facts available elsewhere, it will modernize our process and eliminate Form 397. However, context matters. During the past 2 years, the FCC has issued more than a dozen rulemakings to modernize its media policies. It has issued 10 orders doing the same. As for efforts to modernize diversity policies, well, we're told to wait. Now, I think good things come to those who wait, and I think patience is a virtue. But I think we've waited long enough. Under the Communications Act, this agency has a duty to develop policies to support the diversity of broadcast ownership. To this end, it has a responsibility to develop rules to support the review of the equal employment opportunity practices of broadcast licensees. A proceeding to address data related to this effort has been kicking around these halls for a decade and a half. Recognizing this fact, in the rulemaking that led up to today's decision regarding Form 397, my former colleague and I asked for it to seek comment on compliance and enforcement of the agency's equal employment opportunity obligations. Simple enough. But today's decision takes a pass. We are told this is not the right time to address these matters. Only at my request, along with that of my current colleague, Commissioner Starks, do we have a promise to do this another day, down the road, in yet another rulemaking 3 months hence. Now, I'm an optimist, but I'm also impatient. So while I appreciate the practical decision to eliminate Form 397, I am disappointed that we put the broader effort to address discriminatory practices related to media ownership off for the future. because media ownership matters. What we see and hear says so much about who we are as individuals, as communities, and as a nation. And I want this agency's policies to reflect our diversity and our obligations under the law. For these reasons, I choose to concur.
Thank you. Commissioner Starks.
This is the first item that I've had to consider under the Chairman's Modernization of Media Regulation initiative. The media regulations at issue here today, the Commission's Equal Employment Opportunity Rules, are amongst our most longstanding and important as they prohibit discrimination in hiring at broadcast stations. And while I concur in the matter before me, namely whether the Commission can rightfully eliminate Form 397, today's action does not adequately face our statutory obligation to ensure that broadcasters are seeking and attracting diverse employees. Representation matters, and workforce diversity in the media is critical to ensure that all stories are told and all communities are served. These critical rules do require an update. The Commission last substantively considered these EEO rules in 2004. 15 years ago, the Commission committed to collect EEO data from our broadcast licensees as part of the agency's statutory duty. But data collection has been stalled since then because the Commission has left unresolved a single narrow question about whether that data should be confidential or not. And because we have failed to follow through on that commitment to collect workforce diversity data, our ability to better understand the landscape of our media workforce remains stunted. We do not correct that error here today. And if not now, when? As the Commission noted just a few months ago, our EEO rules are essential to the public interest, and given that importance, some brief historical context is helpful. Our EEO rules originated in the late 1960s in the aftermath of key civil rights gains, the Kerner Commission report, and the assassination of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King. And these rules require, open quote, equal opportunity in employment shall be afforded by all licensees of broadcast stations to all qualified persons, and no person shall be discriminated against in employment by such stations because of race, color, religion, national origin, or sex, end quote. When promulgating these rules, the Commission also imposed on each licensee of a certain size a requirement to annually report to the Commission statistics concerning the racial, ethnic, and gender makeup of its workforce. In the early 1990s, Congress codified the Commission's EEO rules, including the form used to collect workforce data, Form 395B. After two court decisions at the turn of the 21st century caused the Commission to reconsider some of its EEO rules, the FCC suspended the use of Form 395B. But the suspension was intended to be temporary, and the Commission moved quickly to reinstate Form 395B and support its statutory duties under EEO. As the Commission noted in the reinstation of Form 395B, I quote, collection of television broadcast industry employment data is required by the Communications Act, close quote. Moreover, Congress not only directed the Commission to collect broadcast workforce data, but required it to use Form 395B. In 2004, the Commission adopted a slightly revised Form 395B and sought OMB approval to use the form. At the same time, the Commission issued a further notice of proposed rulemaking seeking comment on whether the Commission should break from its well-established precedent of making this data public and instead begin to keep the data collected as confidential. OMB improved the Form 395B for use on the condition that the Commission resolve the open confidentiality issue. At the time, then Chairman Michael Powell commented on the reinstatement of the form, and I quote, I am proud to support this item, which revises and re-implements annual employment reports from broadcasters. This data will allow the Commission to accurately identify and report industry trends and has been collected by the Commission for years, close quote. Fast forward to today. 15 years and several administrations later, the use of Form 395B to collect EEO data remains suspended, and the further notice remains unresolved on this single issue of confidentiality. Yet there is evidence that this form has not been long forgotten. In 2008, the Commission revised the form to harmonize its categories with a similar form used by the EEOC, and on 3 occasions, the Commission resubmitted the form to OMB to extend its approval, and our most recent submission by this Commission was in May of 2017. As a result, this most recent Form 395B was approved in August of 2017 and will retain its OMB approval until August of 2020. It's ready to go, just waiting for the Commission to tie up that loose end on confidentiality. Now, with that long and winding history in mind, one can understand why I find it disappointing that the matter before us regards EEO Form 397 rather than finalizing what is a long overdue Form 395B. So why so much fuss over a single, simple form? Over the past 15 years, according to the best data currently available, data painstakingly compiled by a third party, the proportion of people of color employed at television and radio broadcast stations has remained unacceptably low, particularly when considering the increasing diversity within our country. The stakes are high, and we can do better. On its face, the elimination of Form 397, the broadcast midterm report, is narrow and not altogether problematic. Today's order reasons that the information collected through this form is already collected elsewhere and is easily accessible to relevant Commission staff. And in the few cases where the information is not otherwise collected, the item proposes minor tweaks to our website and our databases. Although it is somewhat hard to understand how the form constitutes an undue burden, it is submitted once every 8 years and by the Commission's own estimates will take a half hour to fill out. On balance, and based on the record, eliminating Form 397 seems reasonable. I agree in part with the Chairman's Modernization of Media Regulation initiative in the sense that the Commission should eliminate clearly obsolete or unnecessary rules. To me, however, regulatory modernization means more. While the work previously done so far is appropriate, some basic and foundational statutory obligations remain unmet, and rules and policies that are truly in need of modernization remain unchanged. In my view, the Commission needs to execute the will of Congress by seeking out areas to modernize where we are falling short of our obligations. This is particularly true with respect to our responsibility for collecting broadcast workforce data, where the Commission has not met its statutory duty for over 15 years. In some instances, modernization may mean removing regulations that are outdated from the books, but that cannot be the whole story. If I told you I was going to modernize my car, you would not expect me to remove its engine, wheels, seats, and leave it immobile. You'd expect me to replace each of those parts, so in the end, I have something better. And even if in the midst of that process I decide not to replace older parts that are outdated, obsolete, or broken, you would still expect me to have a car that can drive, hopefully better than before. For that reason, moving forward, I will endeavor to approach each of these modernization of media regulation items with a consistent framework. No matter how narrow the proceeding or how minor the form or rule being eliminated, I will look into each item to make sure that the Commission is meeting its broader statutory obligations and key mission. In the future, when the Commission proposes to eliminate a rule or regulation, we must ensure that the Commission's underlying statutory obligations are otherwise addressed, or make a commitment to address any unmet requirements under the law. In the instance of an unmet statutory obligation, we should always seek concrete steps to make progress towards compliance with the law, or make a firm plan to engage in such steps in a limited period of time to demonstrate our commitment to those obligations. In this instance, the Commission titles this item Elimination of Obligation to File Broadcast Midterm Report Form 397 under Section 73.2080F2. It is clearly more than that. This item amends our EEO rules, yet still leaves unaddressed key statutory directives in that area. Recognizing this, I engaged in good faith with the Chairman's office and the Media Bureau to determine with specificity the status of efforts to resolve the Form 395B confidentiality rulemaking. I was told of unsuccessful Commission efforts to solve the problem many years ago, and so I proposed a clear path forward on the 2004 further notice of proposed rulemaking that has remained outstanding for 15 years. Issue a notice specifically asking the parties to refresh the record on Form 395B on the confidentiality issue so that we can finally begin to understand our media workforce and bring the matter to a resolution. Unfortunately, that request was denied. However, I worked closely and with the full support of Commissioner Rosenworcel, and we obtained the commitment in this item to issue a further notice on our EEO rules more generally. I am hopeful that interested parties can utilize that forthcoming docket to raise their voices regarding any EEO shortcomings, including data collection, that need to be addressed. Standing alone, this item is not objectionable, and so I will concur. But this item does not stand alone. It is part of the Commission's broader EEO framework, and since today's item pulls at the thread of that regime, we must understand what we're unraveling. I will discuss with the Chairman how we can proceed to fully reinstitute Form 395B and ensure that the Commission complies with the law. I'd like to extend my thanks to the Media Bureau that prepared this item.
Thank you, Commissioner. The British cartoonist Fran Orford published a cartoon with a drawing of a man and a woman with a big stack of papers between them. The caption read, "The idea that bureaucracy is on the increase is ridiculous, and I have the reports to prove it." Now, for the last 2 years, one of our goals at the FCC has been to get rid of unnecessary bureaucratic red tape. That's why today we are eliminating the broadcast midterm report, otherwise known as Form 397. At one time, this form served a useful purpose. It required certain broadcast television and radio stations to provide equal employment opportunity information around the midpoint of their 8-year license terms to assist the FCC in determining which stations would be subject to a midterm review. But today, the FCC can easily access nearly all of this information online in each station's public inspection file. And following adoption of this order, we will be modifying our online public inspection file so that all of this information will be easily accessible. Ending this redundant reporting requirement is such a common sense step that literally nobody in our record, not a single commenter, has opposed it. Importantly, this decision will have no impact on the Commission's ability to enforce our EEO rules. Indeed, we recently made clear our commitment on this score by voting to move staff handling EEO enforcement from the Media Bureau to the Enforcement Bureau, where they will be better equipped and charged to take action when our rules are violated. And I'm also glad we could agree on issuing a new notice of proposed rulemaking on related issues. Adopting such a document within 30 days, as my colleagues requested, wasn't realistic, but I am pleased that we could agree on doing so within 90 days. Now, this order would not have been possible without the work of Steve Brockert, Michelle Carey, Lyle Elder, Martha Heller, Tom Horan, Jonathan Mark, and Holly Sauer from the Media Bureau, and Susan Aaron, Dave Consul, and Royce Sherlock from the Office of General Counsel. I thank you for all of your work to update our media rules for the digital age. And with that, we will proceed to vote on the item. Commissioner O'Reilly.
Aye.
Commissioner Carr.
Approve.
Commissioner Rosenworcel.
Concur.
Commissioner Starks.
Concur.
The chair votes to approve, and the item is adopted with editorial privileges granted as requested. Thanks very much. Madam Secretary, could you please take us to item number 4 on today's agenda?
Mr. Chairman and Commissioners, item 4 will be presented by the Consumer and Governmental Affairs Bureau and is entitled Misuse of Internet Protocol, or IP, Captioned Telephone Services, Telecommunications Relay Services, and speech-to-speech services for individuals with hearing and speech disabilities. And Patrick Weber, Chief of the Bureau, will give the introduction.
Thank you, Ms. Dortch. And Mr. Weber. Oh.
Excuse me, Chairman. The captions have not been working for the previous docket agenda item, and this is very, very critical to the deaf and hard of hearing. I have members from NASRA and TEDPA who are watching, and texting me saying, I'm not getting any live captioning. Can this be put down further until captioning gets put up on the screen?
I will.
Live stream?
Thank you for bringing that to my attention. We'll have our folks look into that. And why don't we take a pause on this item and move to item number 5, Ms. Secretary, if you wouldn't mind. Sorry, Mr. Weber and staff, but we will bring you back as soon as we can do so, accommodating the concern that was expressed. Thank you. Item number 5, Ms. Torch, whenever you're ready.
Mr. Chairman, Commissioners, item 5, entitled Implementing Section 503 of Ray Bond and Regulation Implementing the Truth in Caller ID Act of 2009, will be presented by the Wireline Competition Bureau, and Chris Monteith, Chief of the Bureau, will give the introduction.
Thank you, Ms. Dortch. Ms. Monteith, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman and Commissioners. The Wireline Competition Bureau is pleased to present for your consideration a notice of proposed rulemaking proposing to revise the Commission's Truth in Caller Identification rules to implement the Ray Balmes Act amendments to Section 227E of the Communications Act. Section 227E prohibits the provision of misleading and inaccurate caller identification information with the intent to defraud, cause harm, or wrongfully obtain anything of value. I would like to thank the entire Bureau team for their hard work on this item, as well as our colleagues in the Consumer and Governmental Affairs and Wireless Telecommunications Bureaus, and in the Offices of Economics and Analytics and General Counsel for their review and helpful feedback. Seated at the table from the Wireline Competition Bureau and the Competition Policy Division are Lisa Hone, Deputy Bureau Chief, Terry Natoli, Associate Bureau Chief, Pamela Arluck, Division Chief, and Alex Espinoza, Attorney Advisor. I would also like to thank Anik Banoun, Attorney Advisor, for her work on this item. Alex will now present the item.
Thank you, and just to let you know, I might have to abscond for a second. It doesn't mean I'm not paying attention, but I want to address the issue that our guest raised, so thank you.
Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Chris. Mr. Chairman and Commissioners, good morning. In adopting Section 503 of the Ray Balmes Act, Congress recognized the billions of dollars of harm to millions of American consumers from fraudulent caller identification or caller ID spoofing activity and directed the Commission to amend the scope of its Truth in Caller ID rules to reach a broader array of caller ID spoofing practices. Consistent with Section 503 of the Ray Balmes Act, the notice before you proposes to amend the Commission's current Truth in Caller ID rules by first, extending the reach of the Commission's current Truth in Caller ID rules to include covered communications originating outside the United States that are directed at recipients within the United States. Second, expanding the scope of covered communication services beyond telecommunication services and interconnected VoIP services to include text messages and additional voice services. Third, adopting the statutory definitions of text message, text messaging service, and voice service for the purpose of the Commission's Truth and Caller ID rules, and by seeking comment on revising other Truth and Caller ID rule definitions. And finally, the notice seeks comment on any other changes to the Commission's Truth and Caller ID rules necessary to effectuate Congress's intent in amending Section 227E of the Communications Act. The Bureau recommends adoption of this item and requests editorial privileges extending only to technical and conforming edits. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Espinoza, for your presentation. We'll now turn to Commissioner O'Reilly for his comment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The item before us seeks to implement portions of Ray Balmes Act that expand and clarify the Commission's authority to combat illegal spoofing. While some of the statutory language is interesting, I will always follow the will of Congress. In general, I appreciate providing the Commission with added authority to bring enforcement actions against foreign bad actors. So many of the most egregious illegal robocalling and spoofing campaigns originate overseas, including the despicable IRS impersonation scams. While the expanded jurisdiction provided by the Act won't solve all of the challenges involved in bringing foreign criminals to justice, such as obtaining trace-back-related subpoenas and obtaining the cooperation of countries with weaker legal institutions, the explicit provision should at least help the Commission cut through the red tape in friendly nations. I look forward to reviewing the record in this proceeding and will vote to approve. I thank the Chair.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Carr.
Americans are fed up with robocalls, and they want to see action that eliminates these unwanted intrusions, calls that interrupt our days, disturb our downtimes, and disrupt family dinners. So I'm glad that the FCC has elevated robocalls to our top enforcement priority and already taken significant steps to combat unlawful calls. We impose major fines on parties engaged in large-scale spoofing operations. We adopted new rules that allow phone companies to block fraudulent calls. We worked with carriers to establish call authentication frameworks that can ensure the validity of caller ID information. And in December, we created a database that lets businesses identify reassigned numbers. But as long as those unwanted calls continue, so does our work. In many cases, robocallers trick people into picking up the phone by spoofing, falsifying caller ID information to replicate a familiar number. This type of caller ID scam has not escaped scrutiny. In fact, Congress recently broadened the reach of the Truth in Caller ID Act to cover calls that originate overseas, and it expanded the Act's scope to include text messages. With today's notice, we propose to implement these statutory amendments, and doing so will help us take additional actions to address these unwanted calls. So I look forward to the FCC moving to an order quickly and continuing our efforts to combat these unwanted calls. I'd like to thank the staff of the Wireline Competition Bureau for your work on the item. It has my support. Thanks.
Thank you, Commissioner Hart. Commissioner Rosenworcel.
I remember when it was Rachel from Card Member Services I disliked most. Then it was the agent calling from the Internal Revenue Service with his final notice of an imminent lawsuit. But now it's the calls with spoofed numbers that look like family and friends, but whenever I answer the line, I get an automated voice offering me a cruise or debt relief or something else I did not want to ask for and do not need. This is insane. Across the country, we have more than 5 billion robocalls a month. An alarming number of them involve spoofed numbers. This is fraud, and today we start a rulemaking to stop it. Pursuant to Section 503 of Ray Baum's Act, we propose changes to our rules to cover additional communication services as well as calls that originate outside of the United States. This will expand the reach of robocall enforcement, so I fully support it. Today, I understand that the Consumer and Governmental Affairs Bureau will also release a report on robocalls, and this too has my support, as does the chairman's suggestion yesterday that we may need a rulemaking to require new caller identification technologies. But I think rulemakings and reports have their limitations. It's action that counts. In the past 24 months, this agency has had no more than a handful of enforcement actions involving illegal robocall schemes. Our work is too slow. We are trying to empty the ocean with a teaspoon. We need more dedicated resources. To this end, this month, the Federal Communications Commission created a new division within our Enforcement Bureau that will focus on fraud, waste, and abuse in the Universal Service Fund. Why not create a division that will combat robocalls? If year in and year out, this is the single largest source of consumer complaints at this agency, how about organizing our enforcement efforts to reflect that? I think that's what we need to do, and I think the time to do it is now, before spoofed calls, robocalls, Rachel calls, or any of it gets any worse.
Thank you. Commissioner Starks.
Yes, Mr. Chairman. It is no exaggeration to say that robocalls have changed the fabric of our culture. Where I grew up, you answered the phone. It could be your pastor, your kid's teacher, or in a very real way, your neighbor. But now, if you're anything like me and you don't recognize a number on your phone, you don't pick it up because it will almost always be a telemarketer. And one type of robocall, the spoofed call, is particularly insidious. These calls look like they're coming from a neighbor, a friend, or an other legitimate source. And indeed, this type of deceitful practice has led to thousands of Americans being defrauded out of hundreds of millions of dollars in recent years through, as we've heard today, the IRS scam, where people received calls that appeared to be from the U.S. government or the IRS threatening arrest and demanding payment. These predatory schemes are alarming, unscrupulous, and must be stopped. The FCC receives more complaints about robocalls than any other issue. Last year, Congress took action against spoofing in the Ray Bombs Act, expanding existing law to include spoof calls from overseas as well as text messages. I support today's item, which initiates the process of implementing these new spoofing laws, because we must continue to refine our tools, because the robocallers for sure are going to find new ways and innovative ways to break through. In this battle, this additional authority is essential and welcomed, and the Commission will be better able to find illegal robocallers, stop them, and hold them accountable. My thanks to the staff in the Enforcement Bureau for their vigilance and determination in fighting illegal robocallers, and thank you to the staff in the Wireline Competition Bureau for your work on this notice. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner. Last year, the FCC received more than 52,000 consumer complaints about caller ID spoofing. Among them were complaints about an international phone scam targeted at Chinese Americans. In one variation of this scam, the perpetrators manipulated caller ID information to make it look like they were calling from one of the Chinese consulate offices in the United States, and conned their victims into thinking that they were the subject of a criminal investigation in China, an investigation that could be resolved only by wiring money to a Hong Kong bank account. According to New York City Police, as a result of this scam, dozens of residents were defrauded out of an estimated $3 million. Congress has recognized the serious harm this kind of spoofing causes to American consumers. In 2018, legislation was enacted to expand the FCC's jurisdiction to pursue spoofing originating from overseas, as well as spoofing activity using text messages and other voice communication services not already covered by existing law. We begin to implement that authority today by proposing updates to our Truth in Caller ID rules. These updates would allow the FCC to bring enforcement actions against spoofers who try to scam consumers, regardless of where the calls originate. They would also allow us to go after those who spoof text messages and voice calls to the extent that that conduct is not already covered by our current rules, an example of this being one-way interconnected VoIP calls. Today's efforts are the latest step in our ongoing fight against the persistent problem of malicious caller ID spoofing. In the past year and a half, we have adopted rules allowing phone companies to stop spoofed calls before they even reach consumers' phones. We have imposed or proposed fines totaling more than $237 million for illegal caller ID spoofing, including the largest fine ever imposed in this agency's 84-year history. We've held town halls around the country to educate older consumers about phone scams. We've urged the phone industry to help trace back illegal spoofed calls to their original source. And just this week, I again demanded that industry deploy robust caller ID authentication in their networks this year. In short, the FCC is working on multiple fronts to combat spoofing fraud. And for their work on this rulemaking, I would like to thank the hardworking Commission staff across the agency who've worked on this issue. Pam Arlick, Anik Banoun, Alex Espinoza, Justin Fall, Lisa Hone, Chris Monteith, and Terry Natoli from the Wireline Competition Bureau, Melina Barzilai, Rick Mallon, Linda Oliver, and Bill Richardson of the Office of General Counsel, Eric Berger, Chuck Needy, and Eric Ralph from the Office of Economics and Analytics, Garnet Hanley and Jennifer Salas from the Wireless Telecommunications Bureau, John B. Adams, James Brown, Jerusha Burnett, Micah Caldwell, Kurt Schroeder, Mark Stone, and Kim Wilde from the Consumer and Governmental Affairs Bureau, and Christy Thompson of the Enforcement Bureau. cross-agency effort that is yielding significant fruit. Thank you for your work, and we will proceed to a vote on the item. Commissioner O'Reilly.
Aye.
Commissioner Carr.
Approve.
Commissioner Rosenworcel.
Approve.
Commissioner Stark.
Approve.
The chair votes to approve as well. The item is adopted with editorial privileges granted as requested. Thank you. And Madam Secretary, could you please take us to item number 4 on the agenda, which is the final item for consideration today.
Okay. Mr. Chairman and Commissioners, again, item 4 will be presented by the Consumer and Governmental Affairs Bureau and is entitled Misuse of Internet Protocol, Caption Telephone Services, Telecommunications Relay Services, and Speech-to-Speech Services for individuals with hearing and speech disabilities. And Patrick Weber, Chief of the Bureau, will give the introduction.
Thank you, Madam Secretary. Thank you, Mr. Weber. And before turning it over to you, I want to thank the member of the audience who brought the captioning issue to our attention. I understand that it has been resolved. Thank you. Mr. Weber.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning, Mr. Chairman and Commissioners. Today, the Consumer and Governmental Affairs Bureau presents to you a report and order, further notice of proposed rulemaking, and order on Internet Protocol Caption Telephone Service, or IPCTS. IPCTS is a telecommunications relay service that helps people with hearing loss connect with friends, family, and others by using a captioned telephone. The item before you adopts measures and proposes others to improve this service and ensure its continued viability. I would like to thank the staff of CGB's Disability Rights Office for their hard work in this proceeding. I would also like to thank the Office of Economics and Analytics, the Office of General Counsel, the Office of the Managing Director, the Enforcement Bureau, and the Public Safety and Homeland Security Bureau for their contributions to this item. Joining me at the table today are Bob Aldrich, CGB's Front Office Legal Advisor, Elliot Greenwald, Deputy Division Chief in the Disability Rights Office, and Michael Scott, Attorney Advisor in the office. Michael will present the item.
Thank you, and good morning, Mr. Chairman and Commissioners. I am pleased to present this report and order for the notice of proposed rulemaking and order on Internet Protocol Captioned Telephone Service, or IPCTS. A form of telecommunication relay service, or TRS, IPCTS allows individuals with hearing loss to both read captions and use their residual hearing to understand a telephone conversation. This item takes steps to improve IPCTS and better safeguard the funding for the service by enhancing program management, preventing waste, fraud, and abuse, and improving emergency call handling. If adopted, the report and order would integrate IPCTS into the TRS User Registration Database, a centralized system of user registration records currently used in a video relay service program. Including IPCTS user registration information in the database will help the program verify the identity of IPCTS users, audit and review IPCTS provider practices, and substantiate provider compensation requests. In addition, the central registry will improve program management by enabling the Commission to analyze aggregate data, program statistics, and trends. The further notice proposes to require IPCTS providers to include user account identifiers and monthly call records submitted for compensation. This will enable the fund administrator to more effectively verify compensation requests by matching call data with the corresponding user data in the user registration database. In addition, the further notice proposes to allow new IPCTS users to receive service for up to 2 weeks while their identities are verified. The further notice also proposes to simplify the handling of 911 calls placed by IPCTS users who connect to an IPCTS provider via the internet in order to place a call. Specifically, the item proposes to remove requirements for IPCTS providers to reconnect disconnected 911 calls and to transmit with each 911 call the names of the caller and IPCTS provider, as well as the callback number and identification number for the communications assistant. These rules, adopted when IPCTS was a nascent service, no longer appear to serve a valid public safety purpose, justifying the associated cost and delay in completing a 911 call. In lieu of complying with these outdated requirements, the IPCTS provider would assign each user a telephone number that would be transmitted with a 911 call, enabling the emergency dispatcher to call the user back with captions. Pending completion of this rulemaking, the order grants waiver of most of these emergency call handling requirements to IPCTS providers that assign their users such callback numbers. The proposed rule change and interim waiver will enable more efficient, effective, and speedier connections with emergency services, potentially saving lives. The Bureau recommends adoption of this item and requests editorial privileges for technical or conforming edits. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Scott, for your presentation. We'll now turn to comments from the bench, beginning with Commissioner O'Reilly.
I thank the chair. I'm going to submit my statement for the record.
Okay. Commissioner Carr.
Thanks. For the many Americans with hearing loss, IPCTS enables them to stay in touch with friends and family, call for help in an emergency, and otherwise communicate in ways that many people take for granted. It does so by allowing callers with hearing loss to read in real time captions that display the audio of their phone calls. It's a service that's funded through the FCC's TRS program, and in most cases relies on operators that help generate the captions. I've had the chance to visit with these operators, including at a call center in Nevada. Many of them told me that they're drawn to this line of work because of a family member with hearing loss and their desire to help other Americans that rely on the service. Given the significant role IPCTS plays in the hearing loss community, it's incumbent on the FCC to ensure that program dollars are available for those who need it and that we stop any abuse in the system. And this commission is taking steps in the right direction. Last June, we adopted several reforms and sought comment on updating the IPCTS program. At the time, I urged the commission to focus its efforts on two areas in particular. First, on preventing limited dollars from going towards calls for which the parties don't need the captioning service. And second, ensuring that IPCTS users have reliable access to 911 in an emergency. With today's decision, we're taking action on both fronts. By requiring IPCTS providers to perform more stringent eligibility checks, we better target support to individuals with hearing loss. And by simplifying the 911 call handling process, we enable more reliable emergency responses for those with hearing loss. These are good steps. I look forward to continuing to work with my colleagues, as well as IPCTS providers and members of the hearing loss community, to make sure we're doing all we can to make communications accessible for all Americans. So thank you to the staff of the Consumer and Governmental Affairs Bureau for your work on the item. It has my support.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Rosenworcel.
Tucked in a corner of Northeast Washington is a small coffee outpost of a national chain. It's quiet inside. You could hear a pin drop. But it's also revolutionary. That's because it's the first signing coffee store designed for and staffed by those who are deaf and hard of hearing. And it's bustling. I know, because I spent time there earlier this week with advocates for the deaf and hard of hearing. Sitting together with tall, steaming cups between us, we discussed the promise of new technologies, the power of inclusive policies, and the economic possibilities of bringing the hard of hearing deeper into the mainstream of American life. Now, the National Institutes of Health reports that over 37 million adults have some trouble hearing. They are your friends, your relatives, and your neighbors. An increasing number are veterans who were exposed to gunfight and explosives during their service. I suspect every one of them would marvel at the coffee shop I visited. But more importantly, they would benefit from technologies like the one we take steps to improve today. IP caption telephone service is a form, of course, of telecommunications relay service, and it makes it possible for individuals with hearing loss to read captions and use any residual hearing to understand a telephone conversation. I am hopeful that our decision today will improve program management and that our rulemaking will simplify emergency calling for those who rely on this service in the future. But above all, I want to see this service and so many others used by those with disabilities improved as time and technology advances. Because we need the fuller participation of those with disabilities in our coffee shops, our communities, and our country. Today's effort has my full support.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Starks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We rely on our phones for nearly every aspect of our lives, whether it's connecting with a loved one, asking the city about the next trash pickup, or even ordering a pizza. Every American relies on his or her phone to stay connected. And even as the digital revolution continues to transform our society, we still value the simple act of making or receiving a telephone call. Congress has charged the FCC with ensuring that hearing and speech-impaired Americans can perform this essential task through the Telecommunications Relay Service. The variation of TRS we've discussed today, IPCTS, has become so popular that it now represents almost 80% of the TRS fund at a cost of $892 million per year. One reason for IPCTS's popularity is that it doesn't require any special equipment. You only need an ordinary phone and a computer or other web-enabled device to make and receive phone calls with captioning features like enlarged or colored text, different fonts, and so on. IPCTS and the other TRS programs allow millions of Americans, including hearing-impaired seniors and disabled veterans, to stay in touch with their families and communities. Because the TRS program provides such an important service, every dollar spent needs to help those who need the program the most. And as a longtime enforcement official, I deeply appreciate the Commission's responsibility as a steward of these funds and the need to make sure that they are used only as intended. Where we lack adequate safeguards, we must change our policies, and where parties have engaged in waste, fraud, and abuse, we should prosecute them to the full extent of the law. Notably, today's item applies a registration requirement to IPCTS users that will foreclose opportunities for abuse, protect the TRS fund's solvency, and identify bad actors. I am particularly pleased that this item will generate data that will allow us to more effectively manage the TRS program. Through the registration requirement, the Commission will not only know the total numbers of IPCTS users, but also the providers, devices, and numbers associated with each user, as well as how rapidly or slowly users change providers. Given the size of all the federal funds administered by the Commission and the important public mission that they serve, having such timely, granular, and accurate data can only strengthen our ability to deliver these funds where they will do the most good. Following publication of the draft version of this item, advocates for the hearing disabled community requested that the Commission clarify that an IPCTS provider would receive compensation for service to an IPCTS user during the pendency of his or her verification appeal. I joined with Commissioner Rosenworcel in supporting this clarification, and I appreciate Chairman Pai's willingness to modify the item accordingly. Many thanks to the staff and CGB for your important work on this item.
Thank you, Commissioner. In 1952, Bell Labs achieved a breakthrough in communications technology. It created a machine called Audrey, which was short for Automatic Digit Recognition. Now, Audrey could recognize the voice of a person who spoke a number from 0 to 9. More than 60 years later, voice recognition software is pervasive in our society. Many of our smartphones, homes, TV remotes, and other devices recognize our voices and perform a series of commands at the drop of a hat. I know that firsthand, as my kids enjoy asking Alexa to play music every morning. The current favorite being Celebration by Kool and the Gang, which to my ears is an improvement from having JoJo Siwa on continuous loop, but I digress. These voice recognition technologies can also be used to transfer voice to text and help individuals with hearing loss communicate and better participate in daily life. Now, this technological innovation extends to the FCC's Internet Protocol Captioned Telephone Service, or IPCTS. IPCTS allows individuals with hearing loss both to read captions and use their residual hearing to understand a phone conversation. As I was pleased to highlight last June, IPCTS has had a profoundly positive impact on the lives of many Americans affected by hearing loss. and it has grown significantly in recent years. Annual IPCTS minutes of use have gone up more than 12-fold from 2011 to 2017. And IPCTS now represents almost 80% of the total minutes compensated by the Telecommunications Relay Service Fund, or TRS Fund. Now, today, the FCC is building on the important IPCTS reforms we made in June of 2018 to promote improvements in two basic areas: accountability and public safety, and I will touch briefly on each. First, we improve program accountability by integrating IPCTS into the user registration database and aligning IPCTS data submission and verification rules with those that currently apply to the Video Relay Service, or VRS. This will make the program more sustainable and financially responsible by ensuring that providers are compensated only for calls made by individuals who are in fact eligible to use this service. In addition, in the further notice of proposed rulemaking, we propose to require IPCTS providers to include a unique user account identifier in monthly call detail records that they submit to the TRS fund for compensation. And this will enable the fund administrator to more efficiently match call data with user data in the database. Second, to promote public safety, we propose to better safeguard the lives of IPCTS users who place 911 calls over the internet. We would do this by eliminating the need for IPCTS providers to involve communications assistants, those who provide captions to IPCTS users, in handling 911 calls, because that can currently cost precious time during an emergency. In addition, we grant a temporary partial waiver of the FCC's rules on emergency call handling in order to enable an emergency authority to quickly call an IPCTS user back via IPCTS. Now, these may be small, but they're significant steps that will greatly aid consumers in times of need. Now, today's results would not be possible without the work of the FCC's fantastic staff. Karen Peltz-Strauss, now retired, Bob Aldrich, Elliot Greenwald, and Michael Scott of the Consumer and Governmental Affairs Bureau, Julia McHenry, Emily Talaga, and Chuck Needy of the Office of Economics and Analytics, Richard Mallon, Bill Richardson, Melina Barzilai, Anjali Singh, and David Horowitz of the Office of General Counsel, David Schmidt, Andy Bulitz, Leo Wong, and Leslie Smith of the Office of Managing Director, Sharon Lee of the Enforcement Bureau, David Firth of the Public Safety and Homeland Security Bureau, and Belford Lawson of the Office of Communications Business Opportunities. My thanks to the staff from across the agency for your work on this important item. We'll now proceed to a vote. Commissioner O'Reilly.
Aye.
Commissioner Carr.
Approve.
Commissioner Rosenworcel.
Approve.
Commissioner Starks.
Approve.
The chair votes to approve as well. The item is adopted with editorial privileges granted as requested. Would any of my colleagues like to make any announcements at this time? Commissioner, you want to thumb wrestle?
I just want to quickly announce we have our spring intern who is joining us this semester, Wade Burkholder. Wade, if you can stand up and take the gaze of all of us. Wade's a 3L at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, where he's studying space, cyber, and telecom law. And he spent this past summer clerking at the Comparative Enterprise Institute on Tech Policy. Now, it feels like on the commission that I'm increasingly surrounded by Kansans. And so, like almost everyone else on the commission, Wade was born in Kansas, in Salina, which I'm told is halfway between Parsons and Kansas City. So that's a good thing. But he quickly left the heartland and he moved to Grand Island, Nebraska, which is also the home of an FCC frequency monitoring station, or at least it was. I haven't updated my research recently. And like you'd expect from any good Nebraskan, as well as anyone I'd hire to work in my office, Wade has strong rural roots. In fact, he told me when he was a kid, he once worked on a farm, detasseling corn to be specific, to raise money for space camp. So based on that experience and the good work he's already done in our office, Wade, we think, has the right stuff. So there was supposed to be a picture there, but apparently that didn't work out very well. It would have been a lot funnier if it was a picture.
Neither did the joke.
Yeah, it's bad. After he graduates, Wade would like to move to D.C. and pursue a career in telecom law for reasons we can't yet ascertain, but we are very glad to have him on board, and we wish him all the best. Oh, there it is. That would have been a lot funnier if it had come up. This is Wade in Space Camp.
Oh, God. Well, welcome, Wade, and thank you for spreading the gospel of Kansas in the Cornhusker State. Commissioner Starks?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have a few staff changes to announce today. The first will come as no surprise to those of you who've been reading the trade press this week. Bill Davenport has come on board as my Chief of Staff and Senior Legal Advisor for wireless and international issues. I am delighted to finally welcome Bill back home here to the Commission, and particularly to my team. Bill and I have worked together in the Enforcement Bureau, and during that time I was extremely impressed with his keen legal mind, his strong commitment to public service, and notable writing acumen. Bill previously served as Senior Vice President of Federal Regulations at Legato Networks, but Bill has spent most of his career, as you all know, I'm sure, at the FCC's Enforcement Bureau. Most recently as Deputy Bureau Chief responsible for the Commission's spectrum enforcement matters, including oversight of the agency's field offices. This means a sad goodbye, at least officially, to Daudeline Mamay, who has been my acting Chief of Staff and Legal Advisor for wireless and international issues. Thank you, Daudeline. You are incomparable. And thank you for your invaluable help over the past few weeks and months. I will miss your wise counsel and insightful observations, not to mention your unbridled enthusiasm for the important work we do here at the Commission. Thank you.
A few announcements. Sorry. Oh, you're done. Sorry, go ahead. Sorry about that.
My thanks also to Denise Coca, Chief of the International Bureau's Telecommunications and Analysis Division, as well as the Bureau Chief, Tom Sullivan, for lending me Daudeline over the past few months. Finally, I'd like to announce a new intern in our office, Jamila James. Jamila is not here today because she's in class. But she has assured me that her parents are watching. Thank you for sending us Jamila. She's a second-year student at Howard University School of Law. And here, too, I extend my thanks to Denise for allowing our office to snatch up TAD's only intern this semester. I'll try not to make it a habit. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Commissioner. Sorry for the interruption. A few announcements on my end. The first is a sad one. The announcement of the departure of my media legal advisor, Allison Steger, who is here today. Allison and I met first when she interned in our office when she was in law school and I was in the commissioner's office. She came to the FCC ultimately after graduation through the FCC's honors program and joined the Media Bureau, where, among other things, she served as legal advisor. She later worked in our office as an interim media legal advisor back in 2015, I think it was, or so. And then, because we just kept being impressed by her work and loved teasing her, we brought her back as the permanent media legal advisor in 2017. Allison is just a terrific lawyer, very sharp, knows all the issues, but she's also just a delight to be around, even during what she and I have called our trip from hell to Texas, where, among other things, I lost a wallet, she lost a laptop, we couldn't find our car, we almost missed a flight, but then ultimately we did get to have coffee with Mark Cuban, so that was pretty cool. Of course, we then argued about whether we should pay for his cup of coffee since we invited him. That was a tough one. He owns the Dallas Mavericks. I don't know. That's a tough. Anyway, Allison, we wish you very well as you depart the commission. Thank you for your years of service to the agency. We will certainly miss you, but we look forward to following with rapt attention and fondness your career as you progress. Thanks so much for your service to the office. Didn't even make a Hamptons joke. Okay, next we have an arrival, Will Holloway, who is here, I believe. Is Will here? Ah, yes, sorry. To stand for the requisite scrutiny. Will is a law student at Catholic University, where he's pursuing a JD with a certificate in communications law from CUA's Law and Technology Institute. Notwithstanding Commissioner Carr's presence here, it has a very distinguished pedigree in Washington. Will comes to my office after working on Capitol Hill for the OG, Orrin G. Hatch, the former senator, where he's a legislative assistant for education and health policy. Before that, he worked for Senator Tim Scott as a domestic policy staffer. He got his undergraduate degree in American Studies at Sewanee, the University of the South, where he's also a varsity tennis player. Pretty cool. He was originally from Augusta, Georgia, and he enjoys spending his time outdoors hiking, snow skiing, oddly enough, and playing golf. And he's, most of interest to me anyway, he's a diehard, the tormented fan of the Atlanta Braves and Falcons. In fact, I've noticed that he becomes visibly triggered every time he walks by a big poster in our office that says nothing else but 28-3. I don't know why that is. He's also taken on for himself the challenge of managing our coffee operations, so he knows how to be a good diplomat. Thank you, Will, for being here and for the great work you've already done. Last is a bittersweet note. I want to wish a happy birthday to Henry Geller. Henry is well known to those who have spent a lot of time in these parts. He is turning, I believe, 95 today. 95 years old. He began his career here at the FCC as Associate General Counsel in 1961 under the famous Chairman Newt Minow. Henry became Deputy General Counsel in 1962, a career progression I personally tried to chase myself back in a decade ago. He served as General Counsel of the FCC from 1964 until 1970, a very important time in the Commission's history, where, among other things, he argued the Southwestern Cable case in the Supreme Court, for those of you who understand some of the bedrock legal cases that undergird our authority. And he was also involved in the famous or infamous, depending on your point of view, Red Line case in the Supreme Court. In 1978, he became the first ever administrator of the National Telecommunications and Information Administration, NTIA, over the Department of Commerce, where he launched the office very successfully. And among other things, he gave DOJ and the FCC a very critical advice as they were working on the breakup of a pretty big telephone company. The name doesn't quite spring to mind, but I understand it was a big deal in the early 1980s. Henry, if you're watching, do know that there are many in these parts who cherish your wisdom, revere your counsel, and admire your example of public service lo these many years. Godspeed, and we are always with you. Madam Secretary, could you please announce the date of the next FCC agenda meeting?
The next agenda meeting of the Federal Communications Commission is Friday, March 15th, 2019.
And with that, we stand adjourned. opposed the decision that we made. There will be future opportunities for further conversations along the lines of the concerns that were expressed from the floor.
Margaret McGill with Politico. On the robocall front, some wireless carriers do offer robocall blocking technology, but they will charge consumers a monthly fee for that. Do you think the agency should pressure these companies to offer this service for free, or what can the FCC do to facilitate that?
I've urged companies repeatedly now to take all appropriate steps to empower their consumers not to be subjected to these robocalls. Everything from blocking calls that are obviously spoofed to developing tools that allow apps, for example, to aid consumers. In addition to that, as I mentioned, we sent forward or published the responses of 14 companies yesterday to make clear what the steps they're going to take for caller ID authentication. So we are encouraging companies to take every step necessary to protect consumers from this scourge.
Okay, but just to follow up really quick, do you think consumers should have to pay to block illegal calls?
Here, too, I'm not going to speculate on what steps the FCC may take in terms of further regulatory intervention. What I will say is that we are aware of the scourge of robocalls. We are bombarded by them ourselves, and that's why it's our top priority. And moving forward, we're going to be working with all stakeholders, consumer groups, to industry, to others in the government, such as the Federal Trade Commission, to ensure that consumers are protected.
John, go ahead.
John Reed, Bloomberg Law. In the Mozilla versus FCC oral argument, state petitioners raised the question, or raised the argument that the FCC didn't consider public safety in the RIF order. What's your response to those arguments?
I think the General Counsel did a fantastic job at oral argument generally, and in particular on those issues, identifying why the agency's decision was consistent with the law as the Supreme Court and other courts have expounded it.
Casey?
Hi, Casey Egan, S&P Global Market Intelligence. I believe you said the FCC has already been investigating the issue of customer location data sharing before the recent reports about customer location data ending up in the hands of bounty hunters and others. But is there any new information you can share about how the FCC is addressing the issue in light of these reports?
I don't comment on pending enforcement investigations other than to confirm what I said to members of Congress, which is that this investigation has been going on for many months.
Mr. Chairman, Matt Wesolowski from WYAB Radio. Like Will Holloway, I'm a huge Atlanta Falcons fan, so thank you. That really warmed my heart that you brought that back up. I appreciate that.
Hey, your team just tweeted at the Patriots this morning, Happy Valentine's Day, let's go get some brewskis. So apparently they've embraced what happened a couple of years ago.
Yeah, that's why I'm not on Twitter.
You should take it up with them.
Mr. Chairman, the FM Class C4 supporters have been waiting a long time now, given that the sitting Senate Commerce Committee Chairman Roger Wicker has formally endorsed the plan. Do you think we're going to see any meaningful action on the proposal this year? And if yes, tell Commissioner Rosenworcel that I will personally devote a 3-hour block every week to Zydeco music.
You can certainly bring that up with her when she comes to the dais. I appreciate Chairman Wicker's inquiry, and as I mentioned in my response to him, and as I've made clear for, I think, over almost 2 years now, I advanced the notice of proposed rulemaking to establish a Class C4 categorization. As to whether that will proceed, I would encourage you to ask my colleagues. It was converted to notice of inquiry at their request, and so to the extent we are able to move forward, it would depend on their agreement.
Okay, I'm Carl Haynes with Commander Corporation. I guess my question is similar to Matt Wesolowski's, and I guess you kind of answered it. Do you see any movement on the Class C proposal this year? I know so many broadcasters continue to ask about it.
Again, I put forward the proposal. It was converted into a notice of inquiry at my colleague's request, and so I would encourage you to ask my colleagues about their intentions in terms of the way forward.
Thank you.
Howard?
Okay, Howard Busker, Communications Daily. I just wanted to ask for an I'm just going to throw 2 items out there and see if you can give us an update on either. Okay. So it's my attempt to try to hook something. So I figured if I threw in 2 lines, I'd stand a better chance. One is on the broader, whether the FCC is going to move forward on the broader 5.9 gigahertz NPRM versus action on the 5GAA petition. And then secondly, there's a lot of questions about all the TCPA petitions for clarity and all that kind of stuff, and I think there's some concerns that that's taking a long time. So I'm just going to dangle 2 lines in the water, and then we'll hope now for a bite on at least one of them. So,
well, you'll get a nibble, which is that we continue to actively work on both of those issues. I've been working with our staff along with others in other parts of the government to figure out the appropriate way forward. And so these are not easy issues, but nonetheless, so we remain actively, those issues remain under active consideration at the Commission. Not a full bite, just like I said, a little nibble.
Lynn Stanton, TR Daily. Some lawmakers have expressed concern that the FCC might have suggested to parties in the small cell proceeding to bring their appeals to different courts, some sort of a venue shopping. Did you do this? What's your response?
No, and the response that we will be issuing the response in due course. I think the deadline for that is coming up shortly.
Thank you.
David? Yeah, hi, David Cal, Communications Daily. Would you care to update your lifeline plans in any way in light of the developments in two main areas? First, the D.C. Circuit overturned your tribal enhanced support restrictions, which seems to have some implications, including some people say your reseller ban. That's like the last nail in the coffin. I don't know if you'd care to dispute that. That'd be interesting. And then second, on the whole national verifier front, there's been a lot of concerns expressed about it, and people apparently have been de-enrolled. USAC took some steps yesterday to clarify, but there are people pushing for an API and also for access to databases. Are you thinking there might be a need for some sort of corrective measures to improve that process going forward?
Here, too, we're studying the appropriate way forward, and we are guided in part by the Independent Inspector General of the FCC's reports from last year, which showed that in 2018, the improper payment rate in this program was something like 18.5%, and that represents millions of taxpayer dollars that did not go towards closing the digital divide, that were diverted away from needy families and consumers who needed the help. And that is why our reforms and our proposed reforms are focused on making sure that this program is tailored to guard against waste, fraud, and abuse and target that necessary funding to people who really need the help. And I've been to many parts of this country now, from Wisdom, Montana to the deep south of Mississippi, and I've gotten to understand the fact that if you're in some of these areas without access, this program needs to work efficiently in order to target you better. And so that is the guide star for us as we go forward in our consideration.
Next up on the table, Kelsey.
Hi, thank you. Kelsey Griffiths with Law 360. I apologize that this is a little out of left field, but I'm going to go for it. I've heard a little bit of chatter recently about the FCC's responsibility to protect free speech, whether that is in broadcast commercials or in broadband networks. And for some people, municipal broadband networks do implicate free speech because they might have some restrictions on the terms of use. Would the FCC consider a rulemaking to address some of those discrepancies and kind of put some rules in place that communities should follow?
That has not been an issue that has been under active consideration at the FCC recently, but I certainly, as a general matter, I would refer you to the speech I gave to the Media Institute back in 2016, I believe it was, where I stated that I personally, and I thought the FCC generally, should be steadfast in its defense of free speech, free press, and the other protections of the First Amendment. That is what distinguishes American democracy. That is what arguably distinguishes the West, going back to 1644 when John Milton wrote the Areopagitica and allowed people like you back then to do what they do without having to get a license from Parliament or the King. And that's sort of the ethos that I bring to the job, is a firm belief in the First Amendment.
Dave Shepardson from Reuters. Jumping off your Russell Stover comment, I've got two quick questions. One, Secretary Pompeo a few days ago urged U.S. allies that it would complicate their relationship with the U.S. if they used Huawei equipment in their networks. Huawei itself was indicted in 2 federal courts in January. What's your advice now to U.S. carriers? Should they be using Huawei? Obviously, you have the USF proceeding that's now been pending for close to a year. But are you ready now to say that U.S. companies should not be using Huawei? And then secondly, your name has been mentioned in a few articles about the Kansas Senate seat. Are you ready to say yay or nay, you're definitely not going to run, or you're still considering it at some level, if at all?
See, what you were doing was throwing out 2 related lines, hoping to get a bite. I think that was just, shot grenade right in the middle of the pond, hoping that something else floats to the top. So with respect to the first issue, I share the Secretary's concern and the administration's overall concern about the importance of the security of America's communications network. And that is part of the reason why the FCC last year introduced the Notice of Proposed Rulemaking to guard the security of the supply chain. And we remain working with our partners across federal agencies and with other stakeholders to make sure that we have all the facts at our disposal necessary to make the appropriate judgment consistent with our authority to guard the security of those networks. As to what the ultimate outcome of that proceeding will be, I obviously can't forecast, but I will say that the FCC will take all necessary steps to ensure that at the end of the day, America's communications networks and American consumers remain secure from any entity that may be determined to present a national security threat to the United States. Oh, yes. So I've said repeatedly that I am going to be the FCC chairman for the next 2 years, and I have no plans to do anything else during that time.
Harper Neidig from The Hill. Last week, T-Mobile promised you that they wouldn't raise rate plans for 3 years after a merger with Sprint. Can you say whether the FCC would be willing to hold them to that commitment?
Again, I don't generally discuss our consideration of proposed transactions. We will take into account all the facts in the record, apply the law fairly, and make a determination. But as to what that determination is or how we might consider one component of that determination, I can't preview or forecast here. Okay, thanks, everybody. Have a good day.
Thank you, everyone. And at this point, I'll turn it over to Mark, who will run the Bureau press conference. Have a good day.
Okay, as usual, we'll just go through the agenda to see if there's questions on various items. So the first item was the Connect America Fund item. Are there questions on that? We have a question on Connect America Fund. If Wireline Bureau could come up, please. Hey, Sue, how are you? Okay, I think it was Dave Kaut coming up. All right.
Yeah, hi, Dave Kaut, Communications Daily. Can you tell us, did the item that you all approved on the Cap 1 thing, did it dismiss the U.S. Telecom proposal for voice support in the unsubsidized areas?
I think we took into consideration the U.S. Telecom proposal and made some changes to the item in accord with that, but...
That's right, but I believe that part of their request was to delete a section that declined establishing a new support mechanism for existing legacy providers serving extremely high-cost areas. And the commission did not delete that section.
So basically the answer was you did essentially dismiss their proposal, right? Or you declined. You declined.
Didn't delete the provision that declined. Is that
Right. So you did.
We didn't delete the requested provision, but we did make other clarifications that they requested.
Okay. Are there any other significant changes you can point us to compared to what was in the draft beyond what may have been addressed in those things?
No,
I don't think so.
Yeah, it was mostly in the nature of just clarifications.
Okay. What was your name?
Sue McNeil.
Okay. Thanks.
Howard, did you have a question on this? No? Okay.
I definitely have no question.
You're right. Okay. Anything further on this one? All right, thank you. Thanks, Wireline. The next item is the non-commercial low power and low power station item. Any questions on that one, number 2? Okay. Third one is the broadcast midterm report. Monty has a question on that.
Hi, guys. Monty Taylor, Com Daily. I was just wondering if you could tell me a little bit about the FNPRM portion. Can you, I was just wondering how firm the commitment is to have something in 90 days. Does it say the FCC will, or is there some sort of qualifying language there? And And I was wondering also, Commissioner Starks characterized it as asking for broad comment. Can you be more specific about what it seeks comment on?
I think all we can do consistent with the ex parte rules is reiterate what the commissioners said in their statements, and that is that a commitment is made in this order to do an NPRM in 90 days that would look at our track record of EEO enforcement and compliance with the EEO rules.
Okay. I guess, and then I just would want to know if there were any, aside from that, were there any changes as compared to the draft of the elimination of the midterms? It didn't seem like it.
Nothing significant.
Okay. All right. Well, that's pretty much all I got then.
Okay, thanks.
Anything else on this one? All right, thanks. IPCTS, any questions on that item? Okay, Lynn, okay. CGB?
I doubt my question is your question, because my question is just, I'm stupid, and could you explain something to me?
Well, I could certainly ask that question too.
Collusion.
Free press, defended by the chairman.
Hi, Lynn Stanton, PR Daily. I just need explained to me what the communications assistants do on the IPCTS calls, because I'm a little confused about them not being a part of these callbacks. Do they do both the repeating of the speech and the typing, or the typing is being done by the user?
Are you asking about in general or during a 911 callback?
Well, does it differ between in general and a 911?
Yeah.
No, they're not, most of the time they're not typing. They're actually revoicing in most applications of IPCTS, and then editing the captions. The difference between IPCTS and some of the other TRS services is that with IPCTS, the communication that goes on between the captioner and the parties to the call is very limited. They're sending captions in one direction, they're listening in the other direction, but they're not speaking in that direction, and they're not listening to the person getting captions. So their ability to interact with the parties is very limited, and that's in contrast to, say, VRS, where the communications assistant is doing two-way communication in both directions. So that means if they're called upon to set up a call or reconnect a call, it's kind of a, it's a whole different function from what they're normally able to do.
Text, right?
I'm sorry?
The 911 operator would be responding in text, right, to the caller?
No, the 911 operator would normally be, but what happens, okay. In this item, what we're trying to do is relieve the burden on the provider to have its captioners involved in reconnecting a disconnected call or sending information for that purpose if they don't need to. And so what will happen, if there's a number that is a captioning telephone number that is assigned to the user, that can be sent to the 911 dispatcher, and they can call back, and it will automatically go through the captioning provider. Okay,
So
but at the front end of a
reconnected, there was still an IPCTS communication system on the call.
Correct.
That was the part I was confused
Okay.
about. Thank you, sorry.
But then just on that, what happens? I'm following up on Lynn. I don't really understand how it works. Once it goes to the 911 operator, and they connect back, is the captioner then still on the line communicating between the two?
Yes,
Somehow?
they're providing captions to the original 911 caller by listening to the voice of
So in other
whoever
words,
is
they're not the one.
speaking.
Basically, what the difference would be under your proposal, instead of them reconnecting, is the numbers sent along to the 911 operator, who would then reconnect, but they would still be involved in
Correct.
Them communicate.
Correct.
Okay.
Thank you.
Any other changes? Were there any changes to the draft? That's always the question of any significance.
Well, we added some clarifying language on a number of points that had been raised by parties after the public version. The main substantive change was that that the Commission is now proposing in the FNPRM section on the database issue. They are proposing to allow providers to provide service to new users who haven't yet been fully verified by the by the database for a 2-week period pending verification.
And what about the cost issue related to that? I saw some concerns among industry about how that would be handled.
We've addressed the costs more fully in the text of the item that will be released, and the Commission has also adopted a provision that allows exogenous cost recovery for those providers for whom the cost of compliance would affect their ability to recover their costs.
Is that new too? Because that was something I saw them pushing for.
That's new, yes.
That's new also beyond
Yes.
what was in the draft?
Right.
Okay. All right. What was your name, by the way?
Oh, sorry, Bob Aldrich. I'm legal advisor to Patrick Weber, Bureau Chief.
Thank you.
Thank you. The final item is the Truth in Caller ID item. Some questions on that, so WCB again.
Whatever, because I mean, most of it was just repeating what he had said. Yeah, I don't think you need to do much on that. What's that? On which part?
Howard, go ahead.
Yeah, so on this item, there was Commissioner O'Reilly had complained that, the jurisdiction, the expanded jurisdiction won't address like all bad actors, and that there's still a lot of bad actors out there. It's more with countries where they would cooperate with the U.S. Is that correct? And is there anything more that could be done to sort of get at, places, the bad actors in places where it's harder to get at them? Which, I'm sorry, that was a terrible question, but.
Well, I think the chairman was clear that we're looking and working in many different areas to try to combat illegal robocalls and spoofing. This item in particular, though, is implementing the amendments to Section 227E that were set forth in the Rayboms Act, and there they expand Section 227 to include calls that are originating outside of the U.S. So that's what we're doing here. We're not looking at specific countries that may or may not be countries that we're working with on robocalling efforts. Is there anything you want to add, Lisa or Terry?
It is absolutely right that there will need to be international cooperation. There is already groundwork laid for lots of international cooperation when it comes to caller ID spoofing and robocalls. So our Enforcement Bureau is happy that the Congress has made this change to the law, and looking forward to having jurisdiction over calls that originate from the United States. And it excuse me, and recognize that international cooperation will be key.
Okay, all right, but I mean, there's really nothing the FCC can do about countries where there's no cooperation on things like this, right? I mean, that's the bottom line, right?
You're sort of getting ahead of, of the issue.
Of what's in this item.
I'm thinking about a story 2 or 3 months, 2 or 3 stories down, so that's fine. So, it was just the question was raised, and I thought it was an interesting one, so thank you.
This may be the wrong holiday to raise this question, but do the rules address the issue if the spoofed call is originating from inside the house? And any recommendations to babysitters to get out the house? It's a joke, it's a joke.
Okay. Thank you.
Anything else?
Thank you.
All right, thanks a
Okay,
lot.
thanks.
And the commissioners are waiting, so they are on the way.
Fcc report did something. I'll leave that to you. You can have that. What is that?
Beauty. Come on. Either way, you're up ahead. Howard, could I just, you and me, if I had heard correctly, I just wanted to say I was not criticizing this item. I was just highlighting how a legal robocall can be incredibly difficult, and there's only so much room that we can act, and the law is what we were implementing, and I'm supportive of that. So I didn't want to give anyone the impression that I was critiquing the work we did today, which I was supportive of. It's just that the problem, especially in non-cooperative countries, can be, a place to domicile for this purpose.
Areas where the Congress had fallen short.
I had not done that. They decide what they want to do, and I implement it. I thought the language of this, just referring to my statement, the language in the item is interesting, and in the statute, sorry, the language in the statute is interesting, and we implemented it as they asked us to.
Always mangling things.
Let's see. We'll start down here with William, right?
Monty. We'll go with Monty today.
Okay.
William is my first name. He's not totally crazy. Monty Taylor, Daily. I was just wondering, you brought up the idea that the NPR or FNPRM that was tacked onto the EEO item could generate a bunch of unconstitutional or replies that are against the Supreme Court. Can you explain what might be a reply like that? Do you think that the proposal from MMTC for increased EEO enforcement is unconstitutional?
There have been a number of ideas over the years that have been filed that would, in my opinion, violate the U.S. Constitution or Supreme Court, not the Supreme Court, but the Supreme Court precedent, I think I said, or existing statute. And I'm not handicapping where this to go. I'd like to believe that whatever ideas are submitted will be helpful for the process, but we'll just have to see. And though, because this is another round of this similar conversation that we've already had, and I think, but I'm making no determination regarding the particular idea that you talk about.
Okay.
Margaret McGill with Politico. I want to ask you guys the same question I asked the chairman, which is basically, should the FCC have a role in ensuring that carriers provide illegal robocall blocking technology to consumers for free? Is there an FCC role there?
I think what we've seen from the chairman is sort of collaborative work with the industry, and we do that across a lot of different aspects of telecom to see where solutions can be implemented. And so we have our regulatory efforts that we're working on. There's sort of industry FCC efforts, and I support those, but I haven't gotten into more specifics than that.
I would say there's a number of legislative proposals. If those turn into law, I will be supportive in implementing them. I've been leery of imposing unfunded mandates as such that this would exist as one. Those costs are not eaten by the company, but eventually go to customer rates. And so all consumers would pay for something that only some consumers would use is not something I've traditionally supported.
This question is for both of you, Kelsey Griffiths, Law 360. In the event of another shutdown, is there anything you would want to do differently this time as an agency?
I can't speak about the agency. I can only speak about myself. I spent my time. I was here every day that we were, allowed to, and I did a lot of work that I could. As obviously new items were not coming forward, but I, read an awful lot and tried to do what you would expect in the job. So I don't know what to predict what may happen in the future or the next, but I try to do what you'd expect.
Yeah, similarly, I principally run my office, and my staff was furloughed. Last shutdown, I was in every day or most days, spent a lot of time up on the Hill, hearing about priorities in Congress, working on some of my priorities going forward. So I'd probably engage in similar activities, but hopefully we don't end up in that situation.
Could I follow up on that? The one item that I'm thinking of mostly is the technology licensing portal that was opened up during the shutdown. I was wondering if there were any other capabilities that we might be able to expect in the event of another shutdown that might not have been running last time, but that would be determined like essential this time.
I'll leave to the chairman's office runs that and makes ultimately the final cut in conjunction with advice from the Office of General Counsel about what can we do, what we can't do. And so I don't know where their thinking is this time versus last shutdown.
I would agree with that. I think there's a number of things that I was appreciative. The equipment authorization was certainly good news. I had been hearing from some folks, so I was appreciative that they were able to make a determination that could go forward. There's probably some other things that could fall into that category, certainly in the equipment side, and some other areas as well. So I'd want to make sure that it was consistent. But again, I think Commissioner Carr is right. That's something the chairman works with the General Counsel's office. But I think there's room for us to certainly take advantage of the existing statute. And hopefully this won't come to be.
Yeah, Commissioner Riley, Dave Cal Communications Daily. Can you just make sure I understand? You were talking about the, I think you said you agreed with the decision to decline to give the price cap ILECs the voice support they want in the unsubsidized areas. But you did seem to think it was unfair that they have these obligations. So is what you're suggesting is you don't want to give them more money now. You just want to like take the steps, the other steps, finish the CAF 2 implementation and the RAF, so that they no longer have the obligation.
Right, that there is
a
provider that fills that need, and therefore they do not have to have that obligation. Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
So you're not just declining support now. You don't want to do this interim voice support going forward.
Right. I don't think we should create a fund to pay them for the service, and I was supportive of that part of the order. I'm just saying that we should conclude the other portion as soon as possible, conduct the auctions, find a provider to serve, and then their obligation can be supplanted as it is in the rest of the item.
Okay, Howard Busker, Communications Daily. Just two items I wanted to ask about. I wanted to also ask both of you about 5.9 gigahertz, because they're, right now it's not clear whether the FCC is going to be doing another NPRM or will just be, moving forward on the waiver that 5GAA has sought. And I was wondering if either of you had any thoughts on that area, because this stuff has just been, as you know, 5.9's been sort of percolating for a while.
Yes, it has been, and my engagement on the topic, but anything regarding the timing and schedule, I hate to be a broken record, it goes to the chairman, and so I don't know what the intention is on that topic. I've been supportive of looking at this issue in a broader sense. I don't think it's something you look at in a very narrow sense. We have a problem in the fact that DSRC, as it's currently in our rules, is an outdated technology compared to what they would like to offer. So any, actually to fulfill DSRC would require changes to our rules. And I think at that point, and any other point, I'm hopeful that we're going to get to an NPRM that examines all of the issues, including reallocation of spectrum for unlicensed services. So I think, I'd like to see it open up all of the issues, and hopefully we'll be able to do that. But again, all the timing and the substance it has to be. I defer to the chairman.
Okay, and then I also wanted to ask. So I'm hearing a lot of people talking about TCPA, and there's all these petitions for clarity out there. And I'm trying not to make this a timing question, but both of you, I think, have had concerns about lawsuits that are brought under the TCPA, and so until there maybe in some of these areas, until there's clarity, you could have, so do you have any sense of, are any thoughts on that issue, and when would you like?
I've been supportive of petitions for clarity over the past. I understand why the chairman has been somewhat reluctant on those, and he's outspoken on the topic. So I'm looking forward to at some point providing clarity on the TCPA based on the views of the D.C. Circuit, and look forward to addressing the issue at the appropriate time.
Commissioner Carr, did you have anything on either one of those things?
No, I think like you mentioned, people come in on the item a lot, or the issue, I should say, a lot, TCPA. And I'm sure based on those meetings that there's a lot of discussions going on inside the agency. When the chairman brings something forward, I'll be ready to vote, or I will get ready to vote pretty quickly after that.
Thank you.
There's a repeated concerns on the Hill about the inaccuracy of the FCC's broadband database, broadband mapping, excuse me. And just yesterday again at the Senate Commerce, it came up. Do you have any thoughts about how the FCC should be going forward on this? Do you need to just wait while the NTIA runs what it's doing with the states that look somewhat like a redo of what they did after the American Recovery Act? What do you think of Commissioner Rosenworcel's ideas about I think it's the post office vehicles that she's mentioned, and crowdsourcing? Any ideas of your own about what should be done to address this?
Yeah, I think making sure we have accurate maps is something, to your point, that people feel rightly very strongly about in Congress, as well as in the FCC and industry, because getting these maps right, that's going to be what's going to drive a significant amount of support and therefore broadband deployment. So we have to get the maps right. And the FCC laid out a process before I was on the commission as to how we're going to do that. And I think you saw not too long ago, the chairman announced an investigation related to these maps. I put out a statement right away in support of that. And I think we need to move thoroughly and expeditiously with that, and that might, provide some input on a path forward.
I've made the argument multiple times that I believe our maps are lacking, and the difficulty is because they're being asked to do something they weren't originally designed to do. People want them to be granular to the location, and that wasn't what they originally designed for, and weren't, the resources weren't put behind many, many years ago for that purpose. We have improved multiple times. We have improved in different areas. For instance, as we've allocated new USF dollars, we've required geocoding, and that will be incorporated into the map process. But in terms of what needs to be done or how do you go forward, I do think that they need to be corrected before new precious USF dollars are put forward. How best to go about it? I've been, I haven't talked to Commissioner Rosenworcel on her idea. I think she was talking about using the vehicles at our field offices, which are very few, and the field office staff, which is very few as well. And I don't know that would, actually someone who's visited multiple field offices, I don't see that being a function. But I haven't talked to her on that proposal.
I have to run to another speaking gig. Unless, Shepardson, do you have anything?
Just real quick, I know you have a pending USF proceeding, but do you want to speak generally to Huawei, and do you think carriers should voluntarily not use Huawei equipment given that they've been indicted twice and that other U.S. officials have urged our allies not to let Huawei equipment in their networks?
I'll answer real quick, and then I'll jump. It's a good question, and I think we have an active proceeding at the Commission where we're continuing to take input, continuing to take data on these national security questions. I've started speaking recently in a broad sense about our values that we want instilled in a 5G network. I think it's part of that broader conversation. You have governing systems around the world that are very different than ours, and so I think you have to think about free speech, you have to think about IP, property rights, and I think that's part of why it's so important that the U.S. keep pushing forward with efforts to streamline infrastructure deployment so that these networks are built in the U.S. in a timely way. I think that's going to help further this idea of 5G values being embedded in networks, because there's countries out there looking to deploy 5G that don't share the same value system we have in the U.S., and that may be one thing if it's a pure pipe that can't do anything other than that. But when you're looking at a new network that's going to support all sorts of infrastructure, from communications to banking to sensitive data, I think keeping front of mind the idea of the 5G values of the regions that are deploying this infrastructure is important.
So I would answer it this way. I've talked about a number of problems with China, and I don't think that you can separate China government from China companies. They're part and parcel of one and the same, and I think that's incredibly problematic. And I've raised it regarding the ITU or the equipment and what they're doing in standard setting bodies, or the manufacturing, or their desire to capture a number of countries and trade whatever needs to be traded for market share or even a bigger geopolitical goal. So I think it is incredibly problematic. Now, I'm not prepared to tell any company what to incorporate or not incorporate. I understand from good reporting out there that there may be some words coming from, some views or items coming from the administration. I look forward to reading them. People have, it was reported that I said those items may be problematic. I did not. I said that people have raised the issue that it may have an impact on companies that have already incorporated the equipment, and someone will have to make a decision regarding what to do with that situation. And it may be, there's only so much authority that we have as a commission. It may be something that we can help provide some answers to, and it may not be. So I'm not, saying that that's our role. And again, a lot of these things are multiple layers and outside the jurisdiction of the FCC. But I'm incredibly concerned about the role of China government in terms of what it means for the future of the communications services and how they have performed and the behavior and practices that they have employed for the last many years. And I've talked about it. It was good to hear recent questions regarding their role in the ITU, which I've talked about a number of times. and, years ago, and now I'm glad to see that it's finally getting attention. It's good to see attention on the standard setting side of the equation. So I think it's a real threat and a real concern for those that, and it's not about protecting U.S. manufacturers, because U.S. manufacturing has changed. It's more of a global, but it is an approach that is incredibly problematic, and we should be very concerned about that as a nation. All right, I stand to see if anyone had any further questions. I don't want to, I'm not a one-question kind of guy.
To follow up on what you just said, were you speaking specifically about I think there was a hearing last week in which those comments came up about ITU and China's role in that?
Yes, I was.
Great.
I think Senator Cantwell raised the ITU issue, and it was really good to hear. All right, John Donnelly, any questions, John Donnelly? No, okay. All right, everyone have a good lunch. Thank you, it's good to see you.
Happy Valentine's Day. I have a partner.
Indeed.
Look at that.
Yes.
Look at that. All right. Let us know. Go ahead. No. Go ahead.
Well, in the event of a shutdown, what would both of you like to see happen differently this time? I know there was the technology portal that was reopened at one point during the last shutdown, and I'm wondering if you think there are other pieces of agency functions that might be tweaked as well.
As I've said before, I think the shutdown was unfortunate and reckless. It didn't just slow the work of this agency, it stopped it. We stopped responding to consumer complaints. We stopped doing any work on robocalls. We stopped the work of reviewing new wireless services through our authorization process. And we slowly got up and running with services that have already existed in the marketplace and just need additional authorization. Digital world moves fast. This agency shutting down did our competitiveness in the marketplace no favors. I sincerely hope that we do not go through this process again and that we do not shut down again.
And I would echo that. And as I have said, first and foremost, my thoughts go out to the public servants, to FCC staff, of which I know how dedicated that they are. Some folks obviously are accepted and can come in and continue to serve, but a lot of folks can't. And in addition, the toll that it takes on families as well is preeminent. But with regard to the FCC's work, I agree that there are a lot of certifications that need to continue to happen, and what a lot of folks may not realize otherwise is that when you slow everything down, folks have to slow a lot of what we do, mothball it. We're out for an indeterminate amount of time and then try to ramp back up. I have no doubt that in certain sectors of the FCC here today, people are still probably trying to catch up. And so, this is something that I would stress that we should also avoid.
Monty.
Commissioner Starks, you seem to be saying that you were going to look deeper into future media modernization. I can't pronounce that word today, but you know what I'm talking about. Media modernization items for opportunities to enact other policies. Is there an opportunity like that in items that the FCC has already passed, like items that happened before you got here? Did the FCC miss some opportunities to enact policies like you're looking at for the EEO thing?
And so this is obviously, like I said, my first time looking at the media modernization initiatives. Got it. And today is a pointed example of I think that the chairman and folks would say that we're just looking at a specific form here, Form 397. But in fact, when you're going to pull at the thread of 397, we need to look at our EEO framework, the context, as Commissioner Rosenworcel said. And when you look at the context here, we're not adequately fulfilling our duties, I believe, under EEO. Of which this Form 395B is something that I raised, obviously, quite pointedly in my statement here today. By my account, Form 395B is OMB approved. In fact, the most recent submission for that approval was May 19th of 2017, which by my math, I think, was under then acting Chairman Pai submitted Form 395B to OMB for approval. And so I think we need to make sure that diversity in our broadcasting and media landscape is of paramount importance, and we need to make sure that those voices are heard, as I'm hopeful on the FNPRM that we're able to get here today.
Are there constitutional concerns with doing what you're asking with this form, as Commissioner O'Reilly suggested?
So obviously we're going to intake comments. I don't believe there are, as I stand here today. Obviously, we'll be looking forward to hearing from parties on how they think that the record should develop with regard to EEO. Again, I would note back in 2004, again, I can't stress enough that we're talking about diversity workforce data collection that was approved back in 2004, post the constitutional questions that folks are raising here today. And it was then Chairman Powell who said that this is a form that we should be using to collect this important data. The only question that was pending, that is still pending here today, is the question of whether that data should be confidential. And that's why I asked to make sure that for an NPRM that has been stalled out for 15 years, we should refresh the record and bring that issue to a resolution for an up or down vote.
Commissioner Rosenworcel talked about a division in the Enforcement Bureau that would focus on robocalls. So I wanted to ask you, Commissioner Rosenworcel, if you could talk a little bit about the feasibility of that, and how, I mean, would that be as simple as saying we want the FCC to do this, so make it happen? And then also to Commissioner Starks, given your experience in the Enforcement Bureau, I'm wondering if you also agree with that proposal or think the FCC should be doing more enforcement-wise.
Here's the thing. Year in and year out, robocalls is the single largest category of consumer complaints at this agency. Why don't we organize ourselves to resolve them? We've only had a handful of enforcement actions in the last few years. Sure, the dollar value's been high, but the impact isn't. 5 billion robocalls a month right now. That's just crazy. So why don't we organize ourselves here to respond to consumer complaints? Last month, we agreed to set up a new division in the Enforcement Bureau to assess Universal Service Fund waste, fraud, and abuse. That's a great idea. I supported it. But why don't we do the same thing with robocalls and show consumers that we are really acting like a cop on the beat by structuring this agency to reflect what irritates them most?
And obviously I'm hearing this idea for the first time. I think it's a good idea in the sense of you know, robocalls are a scourge that we're all trying to handle. I don't know what the mechanisms are to set up divisions. Obviously, I'll talk with my colleague about it further and get a better understanding of where she's coming from, how it could be accomplished, and we'll think about it and talk about it. But robocalls are a scourge. I do think that enforcement is a strong piece of the answer. In addition to what we did today, furthering the Ray Bonds Act and some of those additional enforcement tools that we get. But I'll look forward to talking about it with my colleague.
I'll ask, since I asked the chairman, he didn't really want to go into it, but on Lifeline, you both said you're ready to, you know, look at the program anew in light of what happened in the DC Circuit on the tribal thing. But do you think the general reseller ban, given all the opposition and now this DC Circuit reversal on the tribal reseller ban, do you think the general proposal's dead at the FCC?
Well, you're asking us to comment broadly on where the chairman intends to go, but I think that DC Circuit decision was telling. From front to back, it's shipped our Lifeline handiwork back to us. It said it wasn't acceptable for those people who are living on the least connected lands to have the least amount of opportunity to connect with the Lifeline program. It said we got it grievously wrong. I think it's time for this agency to turn this around, get it right. The point is to make more people connected to the opportunities of the world around us. We can do that through the Lifeline program by making it accessible, by including resellers, and I think we should.
Okay. Howard Busker, Communications Daily. I have 2 questions. First, on 5.9 gigahertz, there's this waiver request that's been filed by the 5GAA, but then others are saying we really think this issue needs to be looked at in a new NPRM, a further NPRM. Can you, either of you, comment on what approach you might prefer here?
Well, as you know, I've worked on the issues associated with this band with Commissioner O'Reilly for some time, and I believe a broad-based notice of proposed rulemaking is the best way forward. And time is not our friend here. We've been waiting for a very long time for vehicular services in this band. Wi-Fi interests have also been waiting for a very long time for more unlicensed in the skies. Let's have a broad-based rulemaking and get it started fast.
Okay. And then I also wanted to ask you, so maybe 9 months ago, the issue came up about how, and you said, Commissioner Rosenmorse, at a press conference that you were having difficulty scheduling meetings with the chairman. But I'm just wondering, has any of that changed? And can you both, and Commissioner Starks, can you tell us, since you've come aboard, have things moved at all on that? And are there more meetings between the chairman and the Democratic commissioners?
Yes, I have a meeting with the chairman this afternoon. Since I acknowledged that publicly some months ago, we've made an effort to meet regularly, and I'm glad that we do.
And obviously, I can only speak for my part here. On day number, I think working day number 10, I have met with the chairman and look forward to both working with all my colleagues, but working with the chairman as well, and expect that will continue.
Thank you.
I think I'm going to ask the same question that I asked a couple of colleagues, or similar question anyway, regarding the broadband map and where we are here at the FCC. There's a proceeding going on at NTIA that looks a lot like what went on in the wake of the American Recovery Act in some ways, and we are working with the states. Was the data that when you inherited the map from the NTIA, do you think the data was a lot better? Is this going to solve the problem? We hear so many concerns from the Hill about the inaccuracy of the data and how you direct your funding if the data is inaccurate.
It's a really good point. The FCC's broadband and wireless maps are woefully inadequate. We don't know with precision where service is and is not in this country, and that's unacceptable. And we're going to have to fix it, because if we want to solve problems in this country related to the availability of communication services, we're going to have better information. I appreciate that NTIA is now working with 8 states. But I would ask you, what happens to the remaining 42? Discrete efforts on a handful of states may be useful, but what we need is national data at a granular level that is accurate. And then, and only then, can we really assess who's being left behind and how we can make sure that communities everywhere are not consigned to the wrong side of the digital divide.
Yes, and I agree with this is critical to the digital divide. Universal service dollars are each dollar is critical to get that it needs to get to its best and highest intended use. And so when you're talking about bad data, and obviously we saw this crystallized in MF2, where we have data that is not accurate. It's a problem. It's a problem for communities that really need this. They need this to be able to move forward, to allow them to connect, to have their educational needs served, to have their businesses grow. And it is just so important that we have to get the information piece of this right before the policy piece can be served.
Dave Sherman of Warriors. Can I just ask you the same question I posed to the other commissioners, that in the face of Huawei's recent indictments and the concerns raised by administration officials, do you think, even though the pursuit is still pending, that carriers should voluntarily refrain from using ZTE or Huawei equipment in their networks?
I think it is no longer enough for us to be first to 5G. We need to make sure our networks are secure. Part of that involves the supply chain. And I think this agency has got to finish the proceeding it started last year to make clear to every carrier, big and small, what kind of equipment they can put in their networks. Our failure to do that is putting them in a precarious position where they can't know if the network equipment they're purchasing is equipment they'll be able to keep for the long haul. I think we have to move fast on that. And in addition, I think the FCC should be part of the Department of Homeland Security Interagency Task Force on Supply Chain. There are so many parts of this government that are participating in that, and we should be at the table. We also need to recharter the Communications Security Reliability and Interoperability Council and refocus it on 5G security. In addition, I think we should look at how during our equipment authorization process, we could include security updates as part of the review. And with licenses for new 5G service, we should require certification with compliance with a voluntary standard or the NIST cybersecurity framework. There is so much more we can be doing to make sure our 5G networks are secure, and I think the agency has to speed up its efforts.
I haven't looked at the record, haven't had the national security briefing that I'll need to formulate a cohesive answer, but would agree with the call for moving expeditiously as 5G leadership is critical, national security is critical, and we need to make sure that we resolve these issues.
Commissioner Carr tweeted about an article you wrote about e-cigarettes, and he brought up First Amendment concerns with what you were calling for. Do you have a response to what he said?
I haven't seen that.
He just
at
said
all.
that he thought that blocking those advertisements would violate the First Amendment. It was basically all that there was to it.
Well, you know, the Public Health Cigarette Smoking Act has been in place for nearly 5 decades. It was reviewed by federal courts. It says that certain cigarette ads are limited on media overseen by this agency. It was not only reviewed by courts, the decision to leave that the law of the land was affirmed by the Supreme Court. It's been in place for 5 decades. In addition, the president's own FDA commissioner has called what's happening with vaping a public health crisis and has called on all of us to think about our shared responsibility about how to solve it. And so all I've done is called for the idea that the FCC, the FTC, and the FDA should come together, look at what laws are on their books, and identify if there are things we can do to assist with, again, what the FDA commissioner called a public health crisis.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thanks.
Can I ask, I'm sorry, I just wanted to ask, so last week you mentioned the CISRIC thing.
I did.
Have you gotten anything back on that yet? I mean, now that you're
No, but I
meeting
would point out that the Communications Security Reliability Interoperability Council in its existing form comes to an end next month. Now is the right time to recharter it and make it focused on 5G security.
Do you feel that that's a kind of a neutered board right now? I mean, it wasn't given a lot to do, and there were a lot of questions about that, remember, 2 years ago?
I think we have an opportunity to reinvigorate it with a new charter, and I hope we do so.
Thank you.
Sure.
See you, Jessica. Sure.
I think I'm just going to stick around.
Okay. See ya. See you guys.